Chapter 8. The friends travelled on with a slightly different dynamic than before. When they set out upon the trail, Kiera often took the lead, with one of the others walking alongside her. As they went, they would speak of other things than she was used to. The best way to fend off the bandits, the little signs that gave way the fragile crust of a washed-out trail, safety for the others. When they settled beside the fire each night, things were different as well. She felt as if someone had replaced her, like the body attached was no longer her own. Just a few short days under the tutelage of the vampire, and it was already beginning to change. Smoother in parts and angling in others, always waking quicker than before. The effect was delightful, yet the balance of pain was equally strong, like someone had taken a giant hammer to all the most delicate parts of her, banging them into sudden focus, muscles and tendons she never knew existed before. She would not have traded the time for anything, but such a change was never easy, and she was not the only one caught in the flux of something she didn't fully understand. "Is your shoulder all right?" The vampire asked the same question since a Carpathian swordsman had sliced the Fae with his blade. It was not very deep, and had mostly healed already, but the question came each day. Eden nodded in silence, flexing his fingers as if to prove it. He reached absent-mindedly for his arrows, although they hadn't been recently used, and began his nightly check. Things had settled into a quiet rhythm between the immortals, one pushing ever so slightly as the other pulled ever so slightly back. It was a tired balance, yet impeccably maintained. But Jesse was right about them watching each other, and it wasn't just the vampire watching the Fae. There were moments when Eden would find himself staring at Evander, his eyes fixed on that inscrutable face. What he was thinking, no one could guess. It was likely the Fae scarcely knew himself, but he no longer looked away when the vampire caught him staring. They would simply regard each other in silence, like each one was trying to pry secrets from the other's head. Then, one day, it seemed looking was no longer enough. "Are we ever going to talk about it?" Evander asked suddenly. "The day I kissed you." The others froze what they were doing, as the Fae glanced up in shock. It was a rather key component to the aforementioned balance, but the vampire was taking a hammer to that as well. "I have thought on it often enough," he continued quietly, staring across the fire. "Walking beside you all day, sleeping beside you all night. It rarely leaves my mind." A flushed silence fell between them, hot as a dragon's breath. "We should go," Jesse muttered, pushing halfway to his feet. "Give you a little—" Eden's hand flew out and caught him. "No, stay." Never had quite such command been given, yet the same words had been whispered to friends around campfires since the dawn of time. The Fae blushed, then continued quickly. "There is no need to discuss such things, and no need for you to remember." His eyes fell upon the vampire. "I have given my answer. The matter is settled. Move on." The words he didn't say echoed just as loud in the clearing, stiffening the others and ringing in Evander's ears. But instead of taking them to heart, the vampire offered a sweet smile in return. "For now." Kiera was frozen in such comedic astonishment it was a blessing that no one happened to look at her. A dented spoon was lifted halfway to her mouth, tilting precariously, and she did not notice when it began to spill. She could not believe he was being so bold. Could not believe it. Eden had no idea what to make of it. He simply returned to his arrows. He kept losing count. "Do you remember that tune the bards were singing?" Evander continued after a long while, speaking to no one in particular. "The bards I most definitely did not eat." He paused a moment, as if giving the others an opportunity to challenge it. "Kiera, do you remember how it went?" She flushed to have been singled out, but shook her head. There was a dollop of stew on the ground beside her. She nudged some dirt over it with the tip of her boot. The vampire stretched back with an untroubled expression, humming a few notes under his breath. They hung sweetly in the air, like the chimes of a bell, lovely, yet incomplete. "That's not it," he murmured, turning to Eden. "Surely you remember? I can only think of the pleasure it gave you, the brightness of your smile. I cannot believe you would forget." The face set down his arrows slowly, unwilling to count again from the start. "I do not wish to speak of this." "Then we shall speak of something else," the vampire said cheerfully. "There was a wren on the trail the other day that reminded me of you, perched on a tree in perfect stillness, except when it opens its mouth to sing, it flew away when my shadow fell over it. I was sorry to see it go." Eden stared in silence, fingers itching for his bow. "Or perhaps I shall remind you of my better qualities, in case you have begun to forget. I saved your life on numerous occasions. I have stopped myself from eating the children more times than I will ever admit." Evander spoke like it was just the two of them, ticking things off on his hands, stoking at the tension like the embers of a fire. "I am quiet on the trail, and keep watch better than the rest, and while you have no way yet to know it, I am an also exceedingly good—" Eden pushed abruptly to his feet, sweeping from the clearing without a backwards glance. The others stared after him without moving, without even breathing, as if some spell had rooted them to the spot. After a minute had passed, Kiera turned with accusation to Evander. "Is that what you wanted?" His eyes stayed fixed upon the trees. "It is a start." Eden swept gracefully through the forest without a clear thought as to where he was going, propelled only by a rush of feeling, one that had become too powerful to ignore. Too long he had tried to contain it. His body ached with the effort, like trying to hold back a rising tide. He had walked away, he told himself. He had not fled. But he wasn't sure it mattered. The end result was the same. His only consolation were the woods themselves, painted gold in the fading sunset, laced with the same patterns and scents he'd known as a boy. He peered through their blazing canopy to the sun itself, letting it burn the backs of his eyes. A stab of pain rushed through him, followed by a sightless oblivion. He stared a moment longer, trembling, like a new sword pulled from the fire. How many times had he sought refuge in such a place, finding comfort in the easy song of the birds, the gentle rush of the stream. Each of his people took solace in those simple beauties, but to him they had become a true sanctuary. Always another ridge in the distance, always another peak to climb. Movement. He had become addicted. His friends had chuckled it off as an obsession. His lovers had fallen in priority before drifting away. He was always relieved to be alone again. The beat of his own heart, the rhythm of his own feet. It had been the same way since he was a child. There was a rush of air behind him. He closed his eyes against the burn. "What do you want, Evander?" Of course the man had followed him. He'd been following him without mercy for over a month, shadowing his footsteps, haunting his dreams. Why should tonight be any different? When he didn't receive an answer, he cracked open his eyes, only to see the vampire standing in front of him. He stood like an ivory spear against all that flaming color. His black hair was burnished gold. Those eyes found him as they always did, tracing him slowly up and down. "You know what I want." The words settled inside him like a stone, dragging him further from that protection. He stared for a moment, unable to comprehend its grip, then shook his head in wonder. "Why do you speak to me this way?" Evander paused, like he had not expected to be asked. After a few trailing moments, he replied the same way as the last. "You know why." The Fae tensed slightly, like the answer had disappointed him. "You have my word on that." Evander ground his jaw together, straining the edge of his patience. "Perhaps I cannot leave it. Try bloody harder." Eden opened his mouth to say something else, flushed with anger, ready for the fight. But the sight of Evander wilted him just as fast. He turned to face a different direction, pressing his wrist to his forehead, as if the mere idea was enough to cause him physical pain. "Just leave," he breathed. "Please, I cannot do this with you." Whether he meant the conversation or something more, it was unlikely either of the men would ever know, but the vampire stood his ground. "You look for me the same way I look for you. In a fight, in the morning." He took a step closer. "You were stalling with the Carpathians, hoping I would get to you in time." Eden threw up his hands, whipping back around. "You are a vampire and we were outnumbered. Yes, I was hoping you'd return. I thought we were all about to die." "You are never happier than when you think you're about to die," Evander interrupted sharply, before cooling with a smile. "It is one of the reasons we might do so well together." Eden let out a hard breath of laughter. "Is this a seduction?" His bright eyes glimmered in the fading light, both a warning and a challenge. "Or perhaps you think there is no reason for that. Do not think I've forgotten the things you and Jesse said. He was taunting you. He said you could kill the pair of them and simply have me. His words." The Fae paused. "You agreed with him." He paused again. "Do you agree with him still?" "Is that why you've been angry?" Evander asked in surprise. "Is that the reason for your hesitation? You think I do not wish to offer you a choice, or that I have limited your options somehow? Of course I wish for you to choose. It is the reason I have kept asking the question." "And I have given you my answer," Eden shot back. "Still you persist." He shook his head, quoting bitterly under his breath. "Limited my options." He stepped forward abruptly, fists balled at his sides. "You attacked me, bit me, stalked me, then attacked me again. Since you nearly killed me in the forest, you have haunted my every thought. I believed I was going mad when I continued to see you amongst the trees. Thank the gods the others could see you too." He was breathing very quickly, chest moving up and down. "I allowed you to stay. I staked you upon my honor. I gave you my trust and placed the lives of my friends in your hands. Now you would ask this of me as well?" His voice rose uncontrollably until he finished in a near shout. You are everywhere, Evander. I see nothing each waking moment. You have made yourself the only choice." The vampire stepped back, struck silent as a ghost. In a way, it was the greatest declaration of feeling he could have received. Shouted in anger, surrendered in a fit of rage. Truth be told, it was rather a standard reaction for a Fae. When he finally answered, it was quiet, a stark contrast. "I ask nothing beyond what you already desire." "And what do you know of my desires?" Eden shouted, throwing up his hands. "What makes you claim to know my heart better than I know it myself?" Evander's eyebrows lifted, like he had given something away. "A Fae who doesn't know his own heart," he quipped. "Quite the conundrum." "You are overstepping. This has gone too far." "We have not even started." Eden threw up his hands again and walked away. At least he tried. No sooner had he taken 3 steps than Evander was already standing in front of him again, holding him by the wrists. "Do not touch me!" "Stop walking away!" They squared each other, flushed and panting. Even the vampire, who was usually so cool, found blood racing in his veins. But there was something about the Fae's expression that reminded him very much of that bird in the branches. He was suddenly afraid he'd take flight. "I do not wish to upset you," he said softly. "Truly, Eden, that is the last thing I wish." The Fae stood trembling before him, white-faced with rage. "Then what do you want from me? What must I do?" Evander regarded him a moment, then his face softened with the hint of a smile. "I want to kiss you again. I want you to kiss me." Eden cursed in frustration, storming away once more. "You are relentless!" The vampire grabbed him by the shoulders, shoving him into the base of a tree. There was a brief struggle, followed by several more choice profanities, but the Fae was unable to escape. "Let go!" he demanded, still trying to free himself. "Don't touch me!" The word struck between them, loud and sharp, and tinged with something different, a distant kind of pain, like an old wound that never healed right, one that stung when mishandled. Evander took a step back, staring deep into his eyes. "When I drank your blood, it created a bond between us, something that will last as long as we do, something that can be ended only by death." Eden stared back in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "I can feel the things you're feeling. I can follow where you go." Evander took a breath to steady himself, as if he'd never discussed such things out loud. "It is exceedingly rare." "That's madness. There is no such thing." "Is it possible to lie to a Fae?" Eden went frightfully quiet. "When you told me there were things you could not give," Evander continued softly, "you meant it." He paused. "But a part of you wanted to. A part of you wants to kiss me right now." The Fae shook his head like he could ward it away. "No," he began shakily. "I don't want to see you anymore." "If that was true, I would be gone," the vampire murmured, stepping closer. "I would leave tonight, and you would never see me again." "But you want this. I can feel it. That thing you've refused to name, the one you've forbidden to yourself. I can feel that." A rendering. A fact. It occurred to the Fae in that moment, perhaps he had fled after all, and perhaps it had mattered a great deal. "You want this," Evander whispered again, a quiet affirmation. The two locked eyes, then he leaned in with a sudden kiss. Their faces tumbled awkwardly together, like the pieces of two very different puzzles, trying to find a way to fit. When Evander touched Eden's shirt, sliding a smooth hand along the lines of his stomach, Eden shivered and pulled away, his back pressed roughly against the tree. "That is too much," he breathed, trying to steady himself. A part of him was desperate for the vampire to hear it. Another part was just as desperate for him to disagree. "Something as great as this?" He forced Evander to look him in the eyes. "There is no coming back from it." The vampire let out a burst of laughter. "You're such an optimist," he mused affectionately, tucking back a strand of the Fae's bright hair. "You think there's any coming back?" The vampire kissed him again, hands sliding out of sight, finding the clasps on clothing, as shirts began falling one after another to the forest floor. It wasn't until a breeze picked up that Eden leaned away suddenly, still unsure whether he wanted it to happen. He froze in a split second of indecision, wavering. Then he reached forward and ran both hands through Evander's dark hair. He caught his breath, then smiled. "I've wanted to do that a long time." They grabbed each other at the same time, bodies pulling together, fingers tangling into hair, their lips crushed together, hungry and bruising, and when each of them took a simultaneous step forward, the ground slipped out beneath them and sent both tumbling to the forest floor. They laughed a moment, blushed and panting, before finding their way more slowly into each other's arms. Eden brushed some leaves from the vampire's hair. Evander wiped a smear of dirt from his cheek. Their lips were almost touching, when Eden pulled back with a whisper. "Don't bite me." The vampire grinned and pulled him closer. "I make no promises." Chapter 9. Eden and Evander didn't come back to camp that night. Neither were they to be found the morning after. The others saw no trace of them until the following afternoon. "Wonderful," Jesse grumbled under his breath. "Here they come." The shifter had slept poorly, tossing and turning all through the night. He had been restless that morning as well, trying to busy himself with the day's tasks. But no sooner would he start than he'd stop abruptly, with no seeming provocation, glaring in frustration at the distant trees. It wasn't until the immortals returned that Kiera understood why. Oh, right. Eden was glowing. She had grown used to a certain level of radiance from the Fae, a predictable degree of heavenly beauty, but never had she seen him lit up in such a way. It was impossible to look at anything else. The only one who might have matched him was the vampire at his side. Evander looked happy, but tired. He was relaxed in a way she had never seen, one that made him all the more irresistible. No longer was he searching for the Fae. The man was walking alongside him. His eyes flicked over every so often, just to be sure, the hollows beneath them bruised with the faintest of shadows. She wasn't surprised. Fae were known for their endurance. "Good morning," Eden called brightly as they approached. Her lips pursed as she lifted a hand. "Good afternoon." The vampire swept past them towards the pile of kindling, gathering the makings of a fire, while Eden breezed quickly in the opposite direction, heading straight for the tent. "How was your night?" asked Jesse dryly as he passed. "Oh, you know, fine." He vanished a second later behind the door. Jesse's eyes hardened, and he reached theatrically for the hilt of his sword. Kiera swatted down his hand with a giggle, pulling him back and speaking under her breath. "It's sweet," she whispered. "Why must you have a problem with it?" He ground his teeth in irritation, raking back his hair. "You could not hear them so clearly as I," he muttered. "It was ceaseless." "It's sweet," she said again, more sternly this time. "They like each other. They have liked each other for a long while. Why must there be something wrong in it?" They watched as the vampire smiled to himself, splitting apart a log with his bare hands. The two pieces fell soundlessly to the ground, rolling themselves still. Jesse held back a shudder. Why indeed? They lingered a moment longer before slipping inside the tent themselves. In hindsight, it was quite possible the Fae was hoping for a few minutes of privacy in the hopes of being discreet. When they came inside, he was in the process of changing his clothes, and it was a sight to behold. "Seven hells!" Jesse exclaimed, yanking away his tunic. The Fae's usually smooth skin was marked with a dozen slender crescents, vampiric bites that covered him from head to toe. They weren't very deep, but they were everywhere. His neck and both his wrists, the side of his ribs, the curve of his shoulder, the top of his hip. He snatched the shirt back with a glare, pulling it over his head. "Leave or I'll shoot you." "Don't strain yourself," Jesse answered with a grin. He seemed to be having a much easier time with things, now that he realized the Fae's evening had come at a price. "You've lost a lot of blood, Eden. You need to gather your strength." The Fae reached for his bow, and Jesse vanished like a ghost. Kiera waited until the tent fluttered shut behind him, and she and the Fae were alone. Then she caught Eden's arm ever so gently, drawing her fingertips around a bite on the side of his hand. "Does it hurt?" she asked shyly. He hesitated, then glanced down with a trace of a smile. Precisely the right amount. She flushed with a grin and released him, casually straightening the rumpled blankets as he finished getting dressed. He might have lost just as much blood as the shifter had teased, but his eyes were bright and his movements were quick as ever. In only a few seconds, he was finished. "Are you ready?" he asked over his shoulder, waiting for some reason, though his eyes were already glued to the thin crack of light. "You two haven't eaten, have you?" She shook her head, crossing to the side. "No, we haven't eaten." She reached for the door, then hesitated, trying her best to hold back the question. After a second, she flashed him a quick look. "How are you not—" She couldn't say frightened. If she said frightened, he would never let her live it down. "Concerned." He regarded her fondly, eyes warming with a smile. "If I didn't do something every time I was concerned, I'd have never left Farion. I would have never even gotten to Farion. I'd still be feasting with the others in my father's halls." He opened his mouth to say something further, then turned to her instead. "That's no way to live, is it?" "I guess not." The two shared a smile, then headed into the sun. And perhaps the most frightening thing to happen yet, the vampire had attempted to make breakfast. He'd done this by pouring a handful of porridge into a pot, then setting that pot on the fire. He'd been personally offended when it started to smoke, then worried. What was he missing? "It needs some water." Eden came up behind him, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "I'll get some. The rest of you can start with the fruit." Only then did Kiera notice the assortment laid out beside the fire. There were apples and pears, wild strawberries, and some of the grapes they'd found by the trail a day before. Hidden near the back, there were even a few nectarines, though where they had come from was anyone's guess. "This looks amazing," she murmured, staring at the back of Evander's head. She suspected the immortal had something to do with the casual plating. "Thank you for preparing it." The vampire nodded curtly, then surprised them further. Instead of keeping his distance, as he usually did during mealtimes, he settled at the fire beside them, offering a murmured greeting as the Fae's footsteps faded away. Only then were all three of them struck with the sudden conundrum. Awkward. By the time it was quiet, it was unbearably quiet. Eden usually brought the laughter, and to have lost him on such a morning, Jessie poked a stick in the dirt. Kiera silently choked on a pear. Evander looked from one to the other before his lips quirked in a dry smile. "It was fantastic." Like clockwork, everyone started talking at once. "Jessie, did you see the strawberries?" Kiera crammed her own mouth full of them so she wouldn't be expected to speak. "They're the same kind we found in the river." "And these?" Jessie reached for a nectarine with a look of delight. Such treats were seldom seen in the forest. "We were only in the tent for a moment. How did you possibly—" "Don't," Evander said suddenly, catching his wrist. "He likes those." Jessie froze in his grip, then let it drop back to the blanket. When the Fae appeared a moment later, he was still frozen in place. The vampire smiled sweetly and made room for him to sit, while the shifter leaned abruptly forward. "Mind if I have that?" He pointed to the same nectarine that had been taken from him, the one that the vampire had been nudging casually into the Fae's line of sight. Eden hardly glanced up before answering. "Of course not. Help yourself." Jessie snatched the fruit in triumph, leaning back with a spiteful smile, but it was quick to fade. The longer the vampire stared without expression, the more nervous he seemed to become. After only a few seconds, he set it back down. "So, are we even going to hike today?" he asked briskly, in a rather transparent attempt to shift attention. "The sun has already crossed its zenith. It will be getting dark before long." "Of course we are," Eden answered in surprise. "We'll just be leaving a bit later than usual. I have travelled with the two of you long enough. I can't imagine you would complain." He waited for a response with the preemptive smile. When he didn't get one, he turned to the shifter. "We have been scouting all night, Jesse. Scouting on your behalf. Would you throw that back in my face?" Kiera snickered under her breath. Evander reclaimed the nectarine. "You were scouting so quietly," the shifter replied. "I didn't hear a thing." He smiled along as the others laughed, but the whole exchange was a bit sharper than he'd intended. Perhaps he was remembering those bites strewn across the Fae's body. His eyes drifted silently between the two immortals, tightening around the edges as the others planned for the day. It was one of those sacred days for travellers, a rare combination of both indulgence and luck. Not only were the friends unable to go very far, it was an incomparably easy journey. They wandered along at a leisurely pace, somehow avoiding the sharp inclines and harrowing slopes that had plagued them before. The trail they had chosen wound along the sunlit fields, instead, across even ground with none of the usual pitfalls to ensnare them. It was too open for predators, although few had ventured near after the vampire's arrival, yet too small to risk encountering the bandits that sometimes plagued the country roads. For once, the friends could simply let their guards down and enjoy the experience. And some of them were determined to do just that. Kiera watched with a smile as the vampire blurred into a grove of dogwood, reappearing a moment later with a blossom that he pressed into the Fae's hand. Eden startled reflexively, his hair blowing from his face, but he already was starting to smile. It had been an adjustment, getting used to the abruptness of Evander. Unlike most people, vampires had no transitional movement. They were at the start, then they were at the finish, seeming almost to appear. The Fae bit off a petal and blew it playfully into his face, chattering all the while. When the vampire murmured something serious in reply, he threw back his head with a burst of laughter. "He looks like a boy. I have never seen him like this." "If we were hoping to catch something for dinner, it's long since fled," Jesse called loudly, marching up the center of the trail. He alone had seemed untouched by the magic of the day. "I would be happy to flee myself," he added under his breath. "Anything to get a little peace and quiet." Eden glanced over his shoulder in surprise, then doubled back up the trail. There had been many moments since the friends had set off on their grand adventure, many moments when the hike became too much or the hours became too long, or, despite the twinkling sunshine, the day seemed to have inexplicably soured. There was little rhyme or reason to it. It was a melancholy that affected each of them alike. To combat its evil forces, the Fae had developed a cure. "Shall I sing to you again?" Jesse stiffened like someone had stabbed him with a blade. "Eden, I really wish you wouldn't. There was a lovely maiden with starlight in her eyes, who wept beside a river for want to be a bride. She went unto the fairies to ask what could be done. They told her to go fishing and wed what she had won." The others snorted with laughter, though Jesse's face remained hard. The Fae was prone to such outbursts. He used them as weapons. The trick was to clear one's mind, keep from listening. Of course, that was no easy task, with a cheerful immortal serenading one with every step. "Into that sparkling river the maiden cast her net. She drew a man so ugly, his face I can't forget." Kiera laughed again, feeling guilty all the while. Whenever pressed, the Fae had claimed they were tavern classics, but she was beginning to suspect he made them up on the spot. They were all new to the vampire. He turned halfway to listen, a little smile curving up his cheek. "She took him to the fairies, his features to erase." At that point, Eden removed his arm from the shifter's shoulders and circled around in front. He planted himself there without a hint of shame, singing directly into his friend's face. "They sprinkled bits of sunshine," Jesse cracked with a smile, "into the bastard's face." The others broke into a peripheral applause as Jesse clapped his hands slowly, regarding the Fae with a reluctant smile. "You are a monster." "I am your monster," the Fae corrected with a grin. "Now are you going to tell me what's troubling you, or shall I compose a second verse?" Jesse's eyes flashed to the vampire. "Maybe later." Subtle. Evander rolled his eyes, then said loudly, "I'll go check something on the trail." A second later, he'd vanished into the ether. Eden looked after him with a grin, then turned to Jesse. "What is your problem?" Instead of answering, the shifter countered with a question of his own. "How can you possibly sleep with him?" Eden leaned back in surprise. "What?" The two had grown very comfortable with each other, probably more than either had expected, but there were still lines they would never cross. At least, he thought there were lines. But the young wolf stood his ground. "How can you possibly be attracted to that man?" he demanded. "He's unsettling and abrasive, and unapologetically homicidal. He tried to kill you, Eden. Now you sleep with him?" The Fae waited for more, then tilted his head. "Yes." A gust of silence fell between them. "I'm sorry, was there a question in that?" "Forget it," Jesse muttered, continuing up the path. "You want to risk your life every time the sun goes down? That is your business, not mine. Just be sure to leave that map somewhere Kiera and I can find it." Eden paused in the middle of the trail, staring after him. "You're protective." It had taken him a moment to find the word. It had surprised him even then. As if that particular emotion was used so often in regards to the others, he could not imagine it applying to himself. His eyes lit with curiosity as they settled on his friend. "Why?" The shifter flushed and glanced away. "You think I'm being protective just because I think it's a bad idea for a Fae to get involved with a vampire. You don't think I'm, I don't know, sane?" "This is more than that." Eden tilted his head, looking the wolf up and down. "Tell me, why are you so troubled by this?" Jesse's face coloured and he bit the inside of his lip, looking as though he sincerely regretted bringing it up. At the same time, something in him pushed ahead. "Why am I troubled by it?" he quoted sarcastically. "Forgive me for having a problem with one of my best friends sharing his bed with someone genetically predisposed to end his life." There was a ringing silence. "Best friends?" The Fae regarded him fondly, eyes twinkling with a smile. "You think we are best friends, you and I?" Jesse curled his fingers, missing his claws. "I think you are a monster, as I have already said." Their eyes met for a brief moment. "We are best friends," Eden said plainly, returning to the trail. "I just didn't think you were smart enough to have figured that out." The shifter stopped in his tracks, glaring at the back of his head, while Kiera filleted up beside him. She slipped her hand into his, squeezing it gently and trying very hard to keep a straight face. "I hate that guy," he muttered. "With all my heart, I hate him." She patted him on the shoulder with a smile. "I think he knows that too." The days were getting longer, slipping into the heart of summer. The world was coming to pieces, fraying at the seams, and the vampire and Fae were falling quietly in love in the background. It had started as little gestures, bringing each other sweet tokens, finding reasons to linger in each other's company, combing fingers through waves of sun-warmed hair. A day after the immortal reckoning, as Kiera had taken to calling it, the two had begun the hike in their usual places, with the vampire watching from behind and the Fae scouting in front. Gradually, as the day progressed, they began drifting nearer and nearer to the middle, until, finally, they found themselves side by side. Eden lowered a hand silently between them. Evander did the same. Their fingers brushed, then wound together. They had been holding on to one another ever since. "I don't understand how it happened," Jesse remarked one day, stoking at the fire as the evening sun shone through the trees. "Just on a fundamental level, how did Evander stop from killing him that first day after the festival? The ending of your story, it is more what I'd expect." Looking at the pair now, it seemed a jest that one would ever try to harm the other. Eden was lounging with his head in the vampire's lap, as Evander stroked idle fingers through his hair. A tune lingered in the air between them, hummed in the Fae's quiet voice. It was the same one the bards had been singing. "Their song," Kiera realized. "Is it really so strange?" she murmured, already lulled by the gentle popping of the fire. It was easy to speak in private those days. The immortals had eyes only for each other. "One fears the quiet, the other fears the stillness. They both come from a timeless people, and both are desperate to make that time matter. Desperate to feel." She shrugged. "What greater feeling is there than love?" Jesse opened his mouth to answer, then looked down at her with a sudden smile. "Sometimes I wonder if you're able to hear yourself, if you know the rarity of such a perspective. Sometimes I wonder if you realize how remarkable it is, the things you say." She pulled back in surprise, thinking he must be teasing her. "I was being honest." "So was I." His eyes sparkled as he pressed an unexpected kiss to her cheek. "It's one of the things I love most about you. You see things for what they are. You see how they are meant to be." A flush of heat bloomed in her cheeks, and she lowered her eyes swiftly, fighting back the urge to smile. He'd been saying things like that more and more since that day in the woods, when he'd shifted to a wolf and knelt before her. She never knew what to say in return. They eased back into conversation, unaware they were being observed themselves. "It's like they always forget we can hear them," Eden murmured, tilting his head so waves of hair fell across the vampire's leg. "Speaking about us so brazenly in the open, though Kiera is always sweet about it. It's a level of distraction I truly cannot understand." Evander smiled faintly, playing absent-mindedly with his braids. "He surfaces long enough from a daydream to criticize the attention of others." The Fae glanced up at him. "What?" The vampire grinned. His lover was full of contradictions like that. Sharp as an arrow one moment, and blissfully detached the next. Always hearing more than what others might expect. Always caring less. And always caring more. Far more than anyone he'd ever met. "You have been watching this play out?" he asked softly. "The two of them?" "Like a childhood story," the Fae answered with a smile. "Truth be told, it's made me feel quite tender towards them, but I have had no one to share it with before now." By the looks of things, that was unlikely to change. The vampire could not be less interested in the love affairs of mortals, but he was indulgent with the Fae. He smiled in return, glancing over. "Shall we place bets on how long it lasts?" "Have you any money?" Eden asked in surprise. Evander shrugged, fingers twisting in his hair. "We could bet other things." The Fae grinned, but moved off the vampire's legs, settling more comfortably upon the ground. Comfortable was a relative term. For the last few nights, the two had been sleeping together outside. Sleeping was also a relative term. But the hour was late, and the day's journey had been long. "Later," he promised drowsily, "and later again. For now, let us sleep." Evander settled immediately beside him, stretching out his long legs as he gazed up into the night sky. The two had made a habit of doing that together, lying on their backs and pointing their fingers as they traced the constellations one by one. Eden knew the names of them all. He'd been taught by his mother, who'd been taught by her mother. The vampire had never known their names, never heard their stories. His people did not have legends for such things. Eden shivered beside him, and he glanced over in concern. "Do you want my cloak? It may get colder tonight." Those bright eyes opened slowly, blinking at the stars. "Then tonight we shall sleep inside." He said it just loudly enough to stop the conversation happening on the other side of the camp. Kiera and Jesse looked over at the same time, meeting his eyes. "If that's all right with everyone." He phrased it as a question, but there was a slight edge to his tone, as though it would only remain a question as long as no one dared to refuse. They hesitated, then nodded quickly. "Of course. Sure. We'll just stack on top of each other, I guess." The Fae pushed to his feet with a smile, reaching down a hand to Evander. The vampire was quite a bit less certain, looking almost as nervous as those first few nights he'd spent in the camp. "Is that a good idea?" he murmured, watching as the others filed inside. "I don't mind sleeping outside, Eden. There is no reason for you to stay." The Fae kissed him silent, then pulled at his wrist. By the time Evander made up his mind and lifted the door to the tent, the others had already settled in their usual places. It was a tight squeeze with only 2 people. It was nearly suffocating with 3. Usually it didn't matter, seeing as one of them would always be on watch. But the woods were quiet, and the shifter had already run in a wide circle to check the perimeter. Between that and the vampire sleeping so close, there was little need for anything else. "Not so glamorous, huh?" Kiera teased, twisting her hair into braids. They had become a requirement from the others, given up how many times they'd nearly choked to death on her crimson mane. Some nights, Eden helped her weave them. "It's nice," Evander stammered, frozen uncertainly in the frame. Another relative term. In the beginning, the Fae had insisted things be kept as tidy as possible, but the others had been a creeping influence, and now it bore a far greater resemblance to a burrow than a tent. Blanket heaped upon blanket, with no borders or delineations. The friends had begun to simply tunnel somewhere in the middle, fighting for space and warmth. Eden was already lying on his side, gazing towards the entrance with a particularly tender expression, as if he could feel the vampire's nerves. After a moment, he beckoned with his hand. "Come here." Evander picked his way carefully through the others and slid down beside him, his back pressed snug against the Fae's chest. A rush of panic seized him then, an intense claustrophobia made all the worse by the pooling combination of all those scents. There was no space for him here. He didn't know why it had been such a craving. But no sooner had he settled than the Fae's arms circled around him, anchoring him there with a tender, almost childlike embrace. A quiet thrill quickened his heartbeat. His lips curved in a dawning smile. "This is new." He lowered his head slowly, resting it lightly upon the pillowed blankets like the others. He didn't know if he'd ever slept with a pillow. He didn't know if he'd ever slept in someone's arms. It was enough novelty to have a roof over his head, let alone to find himself the company of others. Eden's eyes closed almost immediately, but Evander kept his wide open. He wanted to prolong the sensation as much as possible. He didn't want to fall asleep. Chapter 10. A part of Kiera thought it might be terrifying to share a tent with a vampire. It sounded like one of those frightening stories that children told each other around the fire, one intended to teach some kind of lesson, but was really just used to scare. But there was something strangely comforting about it. Perhaps it was the inherent safety that came with it, Perhaps it was the look on his face. Evander had not slept more than a passing moment. Every time he started to drift off, his eyes would flicker around the tent once more and warm with a secret smile. He kept himself awake instead, savouring it, drawing out every lingering moment spent in the Fae's arms. Kiera had watched with a secret smile before finally drifting off herself. "Good morning," she said brightly, pushing the tent open and wandering outside. Jessie and Eden were already in deep conversation beneath the oaks that bordered the campsite. Evander was watching from his usual perch beside the fire. She rubbed her arms, peering up at the thin layer of clouds blanketing the sky. "It's quite a bit colder this morning. I'm glad the two of you slept inside." The vampire nodded faintly, then threw her a sudden glance. "Thank you for allowing it to happen," he said softly. "There is much you have allowed," he added abruptly. "I would thank you for that as well." She looked down in surprise, then settled beside him. "Someone's still feeling warm from the tent." "It's my pleasure, truly." The two leaned back against the rocks, watching the others in companionable silence. It was one of Kiera's favourite kind of mornings, the kind that was slow to start, with no imminent danger pressing against them, the kind that made her wonder how things might have been if they'd met under different circumstances, without a monstrous dragon roaming the skies. Whatever the two men were discussing, it had long ceased to be a conversation. Jessie was talking at the speed of light, making grand gesticulations with his arms, while Eden nodded thoughtfully beside him, chewing an apple and leaning against the base of the tree. A little squirrel had scampered down to investigate, venturing closer and closer, with eyes on the fruit. As the shifter prattled on obliviously, Eden broke off a little piece and offered it between them. Two tiny hands reached out and took it, cramming full its mouth, before vanishing up the tree. Evander shook his head with a faint smile. "It is like a gift that I should have met him," he murmured, almost as though he was speaking to himself. "But I wonder who would have given such a thing." Kiera flashed him a look, warming with a smile. "Gifts are bestowed upon the worthy," she answered casually. "That's something my mother always used to say." It was a lie. Her mother never said that. "At any rate, you've gotten the wrong measure of him. The Fae is a nightmare. We don't know why you like him so much." To her great surprise, the vampire actually laughed, pushing lightly to his feet and offering a hand for her as well. "Come, we have much ground to cover." Days had passed since the immortals clashed, then settled in the forest. Blissful, sunlit days where they made terrible time. They'd been hoping to reach the river country the night before, but it was still lost behind the horizon, mostly because it had been like trying to wrangle children. That morning was looking to be more of the same. "You will frighten it away," Evander called again, shielding his eyes from the sun as the Fae swung himself into the highest branches of a tree. "You will only frighten it, Eden." "I will not frighten it," the Fae insisted, easing onto a slender perch. "Things do not run from me the way they run from you." He glanced down at a ridiculously precarious moment, jerking his head to the vampire. "Pure evil, that one. Really lives up to the name." Jessie chuckled under his breath, while Kiera pointed furiously at the ground. "Get down this instant! You will break open your head." "Is that mother calling?" Eden replied innocently, vanishing a moment behind a cloud of leaves. "Tell her to speak up." The vampire rolled his eyes impatiently. "Just leave it. I will not even care." But the Fae had no intention of leaving anything. He lingered a moment longer, hovering just outside their line of sight, then leapt triumphantly to the ground. "There! I've got it!" The friends gathered round, staring with a mix of expressions. "You weren't kidding," Jessie finally managed. "You were looking for a butterfly." The tiny creature was perched upon his finger, its delicate body shielded by the curve of his hand. He stroked it absent-mindedly, playing with the tips of its wings. "Yes. What did you think I meant?" "I'd hoped it was metaphorical." The Fae ignored this, holding it proudly to the vampire. "There, you see? The beach I was telling you about. It is exactly that color blue." His eyes danced with excitement, along with a touch of pride. "I told you, things do not run." His friend stared back in silence. It was in these moments Kiera wondered if the Fae realized how strange he appeared to the rest of the world, how very different he was from everything around him. Perhaps all of the fair folk were the same. Perhaps her eyes had muddied with mortality. Or perhaps the vampire was right. Perhaps he was a gift. "You are insane, Eden." Jesse clapped him on the shoulder, inadvertently frightening the butterfly away. "When this is over, we are taking you to see a healer. Surely something can be done." The Fae stared after it in dismay before turning back to Evander. "Did you see?" he asked hopefully. "Did you see before it flew away?" A look of pure tenderness lit the vampire's eyes, gone in a flash. "Here's a surprise. I don't care." Kiera snorted with laughter, heading back up the trail. She was surprised by how sharp they were with each other, and surprised by how sweet. A few days before, the Fae had whittled the vampire a muzzle, then kissed him all over the face. Eden fell into a step alongside him, muttering under his breath, "You cared a little." The vampire shot him a sideways glance, lips twitching with a smile. A few seconds passed. Then, without even a trace of warning, he leapt straight vertical like a cat, coming down in a wild pounce atop the Fae's unsuspecting head. "Wait!" Eden's voice cut off in a burst of laughter as the pair tussled around like cubs, rolling in violent spirals across the forest floor. Flashes of bright hair spun together in a mix of little shouts and snarls. There were several points of sharp impact, until the Fae detached himself suddenly and came up with a blade, holding it threateningly to the vampire's neck. "Behave, or I will make you." Evander gazed up at him, dark eyes catching the light. With a little smile, he trailed his fingers slowly up the length of the blade, keeping his eyes on the Fae the whole time. "Go on then. Make me." A deep blush warmed the Fae's skin, striking like flint in his eyes. Kiera was half convinced he was going to jump on the vampire right then. He didn't. He just lowered the blade with a smile. And such a smile it was. Kiera had never seen one like it. The cougar came out of nowhere. It was much harder to predict things when they do not behave as one might expect. It was why they didn't see the creature coming. It had approached from the wrong direction. It had selected Evander as its prey. There was a sharp intake of breath as the friends looked at the last second, all of them looking too late. Evander was still frozen on the ground in surprise. Eden was still turning. "No!" A blistering snarl tore through the air as Eden caught the beast with his bare hand, caught it by the jaw. Those lethal fangs sank deep into his palm, and he let out an involuntary cry, bracing all his weight against it. He pushed it away from the vampire, using nothing but the strength of a single arm. But Evander had already risen and grabbed hold of it, snapping the creature's neck. It fell with a thud on the ground beside them, its claws still reaching forward, its fangs still dripping with immortal blood. "Are you mad?" Evander cried, rounding upon the Fae. He reached automatically to steady him, but his face was white with rage. "I could have stopped it." "I did not want you to try," Eden panted, rigid with pain. "What if you had missed?" Jesse took a step forward, still shaken by the sight. "Why did it jump at you in the first place?" he murmured, kneeling to examine it. Normally he wouldn't get so close, but the beast was clearly dead. We have these cats in the wood where I grew up. They're cautious for their size. They would never—" His face whitened as he fell abruptly silent. "What's wrong?" Kiera asked, pushing forward. "What is it?" She froze a second later, staring at the cloud of foam slowly frothing from the creature's mouth. Those cats had roamed the woods around Catling as well. She knew just what it meant. It was why they were taught to flee such things as children. It was a sentence as good as death. It was madness. "What is it?" Evander asked over his shoulder, still examining the shredded strips of the Fae's hand. "Is there another?" When no one answered, he turned to check for himself. He saw the foam, and his face went still. "Eden," he said softly. "The beast was sick." Kiera would think back on that moment many times in the days to come, wondering why he didn't choose to shield him, wondering why he told the Fae the second he knew. Each of her own instincts had risen in sharply the other direction. But it was already over. The damage was done. Eden turned a bit unsteadily, eyes tracing over the cougar's mouth. He dulled for a moment, as if he'd grown suddenly tired, before his face tightened with a searing flash of pain. "I would cut it off, but it's too deep. It will have already spread." Kiera blinked at him slowly, realizing a second too late that he was talking about his own hand. Her eyes drifted towards it in a daze, as if some part of her was waiting to wake up. He was right about the damage. The skin was in ribbons. In some places, she could see bone. His forehead fell limp against the vampire's shoulder. "It stings." Evander picked him up at once, leaping over the carcass and racing straight back the way they'd come. He did this at a vampire's speed, giving no thought as to the people he was leaving behind him. They threw each other a quick look, then did the only thing in their power. They started to run. There was no matching a vampire for speed, but Eden had blacked out twice from the pain, and Evander had stopped immediately to revive him. By the time the others raced back to their old camp, the immortals were just reaching it themselves, blurring out of nowhere to a sudden stop. "Pitch the tent," Evander instructed without looking, "and boil some water." He pointed blindly from one person to the next. "You, patrol the woods. Look for anything else that is acting strange." He glanced up suddenly, catching the shifter's eye. "Jesse, do not let anything bite you." Jesse nodded shakily, then threw off his clothes, shimmering into a wolf before the last of the pieces had finished falling and entering the woods at a run. "Speak to me." Evander lowered the Fae gently to the ground, cupping a hand around his cheek. "Let me know you're there." Eden blinked up at him, half dazed by the pain. "You didn't appreciate my butterfly." The vampire's eyes tightened, and he threw a look over his shoulder. "Where is the water?" Kiera raced back and forth across the clearing, balancing armfuls of wood. They tumbled into a haphazard pile, knocking against each other as she scrambled to find something to light. "You only said it a moment ago. I'm still making a fire." "Forget the water," Eden said weakly, hitching up on his arms. "And stop acting like I'm doomed already. There is something yet to try." He turned to Evander, his eyes growing heavy in the blinding sun. "There is a flower my people use for such things. Can you find some for me?" The vampire nodded at once, gripping his uninjured hand. "What is it called?" The Fae wavered as the image lurched dizzily before him. "I'm not—" He squinted his eyes, working hard to draw a breath. I can't remember what we're talking about." Kiera froze dead still behind him. Evander's grip tightened on his hand. "Eden," his voice was soft, drawing him back again. "What's the name of the flower?" The Fae's eyes opened wider, like part of him had been asleep. "It is... I only know the name in the old tongue. Hyacinth. They call it something different now. Evander nodded again, already pushing to his feet. Remthorn, I will get some. He threw a glance back at Kiera. You will stay with him? She hurried forward, sinking to her knees. Of course, every second. The vampire opened his mouth like he wanted to say something more. Then he was gone in a rush of wind, just a streak of shadow vanishing into the trees. The Fae and the barmaid shared a fleeting look. Then they settled down to wait. Time passed slowly, like a creeping chill. For endless hours, it seemed, Kiera gazed down upon the Fae, murmuring little comforts, smoothing strands of damp hair away from his face. He was burning, unlike anything she'd ever felt before. While the pain in his hand must have been extraordinary, he hardly seemed to notice. His eyes were overbright and dilated, gazing at times without seeing into the open sky. After a long while, he spoke. This madness, he said hoarsely, a far cry from his usual voice. Have you seen it? She nodded stiffly. When I was a child, a woman in our village was bitten by a fox in a similar state. She'd thought it was hurt and needed tending. She offered out her hand. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was dry. What happened to her? There was a pause, followed by a hasty look. She died. So why the hell did I tell that story? She threw him another look, desperate to reassure him, even more desperate to cool him down. She wished for the 100th time that she'd gotten water from the river before Evander had left. It was so close that she could hear it, but a part of her was terrified to leave the Fae alone. She was old, she stammered apologetically. It isn't the same. The Fae nodded faintly, but he'd already made up his mind. The map is in my bag, he said quietly. Keep my bow and send word to my father. Any of my kin can find him. He drew in a ragged breath, getting a little less air each time. Evander will stay with you. You may count on that. He'll help you and Jessie see this through. She shook her head slowly, unable to believe they were discussing it. That cheerful sun bore down like a hammer upon them, stunning her senses and stealing her breath. But the Fae was not finished. There was more. Kiera, you will do something for me? His eyes locked with hers, tinged with red but still the clearest blue. I may live, I may not, but there is no in-between. He paused a split second, drawing in a deep breath. If I begin to lose hold on myself, you must promise to end it. She fell utterly silent, feeling as though time itself had lurched to a stop. A lone cougar out on the prowl, a rushed conversation by the ferns. This could not be happening. But the Fae had never been so sincere. You must promise me, he said again. Quickly, before the others get back. She leaned abruptly closer, emphasizing every word. This is not happening. Glycerin and Carpathians, wolf packs and trolls, 1,000 terrors you have survived, Eden. This is not what gets to claim you. He tried to speak, but she beat him to it. It was easy to beat him. That alone made it feel as though she couldn't breathe. The flowers will work. They have to work. She said it with certainty, though she felt absolutely none. Never had her people known of any cure. You just need to stay here, all right? We can fix this. We're going to fix this. She was crying now. An hour ago you were fine. He smiled sadly, still lovely, even near the end. But that is the way these things go, and I do not wish to remain in such a state. He shivered as the fever tore through him, imagining the worst. Myself, but not myself, a stranger in my own mind. You must not let that happen to me. You must take a knife. Eden, it will never come to that.
You must take a knife and end it.
He took a blade from his belt and slapped it into her hand, guiding her wrist until the point was pressed to a specific place on his neck.
Right here, do you understand? One quick slice and I will bleed out in seconds.
She sobbed quietly, pulling away. Please stop.
Jesse won't have the heart, and Evander will stop you if you try.
He reached for her hand, panting with the effort.
You are the only person I can ask. Please, for me.
Evander would rip me to pieces. Jesse would set those pieces on fire. And I would let them. Her head was spinning, and the blade was heavy in her palm. So heavy she felt like it would drag her straight to the ground. Another tear slipped down her face, but a finger lifted her chin.
Kiera, madness?
His eyes were shining. He shook his head.
You must promise.
Their eyes met, and she let out a breath. I promise. The knife slipped into her belt, and she turned deliberately to the other things, cupping her cool fingers across his scorching brow. It makes no difference, she repeated lightly. We're going to fix this. Evander is finding those flowers, and the fever will burn itself away. I'm telling you, everything will be fine. They shared a lingering look. Then he nodded quickly.
Yes, I'm sure it will be fine.
The sun began to slide across the mountains, casting slanted shadows from the sky. Kiera dragged the Fae into the shade, laying his head gently in her lap. Her fingers combed rhythmically through his damp hair, while she hummed a tune under her breath. It was something she hadn't thought of since childhood. She had no idea what made her suddenly think of it again. Is he alive? There was a gust of wind, then Evander was kneeling beside them, a crop of brightly coloured flowers clutched in his fist. Judging by the tears in his clothing, he must have flown across the entire mountain range. Judging by the look on his face, he hadn't flown quickly enough. He is asleep, she breathed. I can no longer wake him. There was a shifting on her legs.
I'm not asleep, the Fae murmured, gazing slowly up at them. I was listening.
His eyes took a moment to focus, settling on her face.
That was a lovely song.
The blossoms appeared in front of him, just inches from his eyes. Is this enough? Evander panted. There weren't many. I grabbed everything I could. Eden coughed weakly, nodding at the same time.
Those are perfect. I will tell you what to do.
The vampire settled hastily before him, throwing Kiera a swift look. Leave. She nodded and pushed shakily to her feet, stumbling backward as the vampire began ripping the petals apart. Eden watched for a moment, then caught her eye over his shoulder.
Do not go far.
She nodded again, teeth digging into her lip. The trees closed up in front of her. A second later, she was gone. The Fae was up all night with a fever, tossing and turning inside the tent. Evander stayed by his side, while the others lingered in the clearing, listening to the night birds, staring at the fire. Kiera was sitting on the ground, holding the Fae's bow. All night long his words had played back through her mind, each one boring inside a little deeper. They flared up with a dull ache as she touched over them, like skin closed over a thorn. If I begin to lose hold on myself, you must promise to end it. Right here, do you understand? One quick slice and I will bleed out in seconds. Please. For me. He'd left her his bow. Send word to his father, but keep the bow. She trailed her fingers over the wood, finding the same grooves where his fingers had held for hundreds of years. She could not imagine a day when someone else would carry it, when it wouldn't be safe in his hand. Could I really kill him? The dagger pressed hard against her leg. They are quiet now, Jesse murmured, settling wearily beside her. The woods had been empty, and he'd been staring at the fire for hours. I cannot hear them murmuring as before. Her eyes drifted to the tent, unsure whether that was good or bad. A part of her wanted to tell him, to share the burden, get an outside perspective. But Eden had been right about the shifter. He could not bring himself to do such a thing, any more than he could allow it. After the death of his brother, life held a different precedence than it did before. She didn't tell him. She pulled out her stone instead. "Did I ever show you this?" He glanced over, then reached a curious hand. "No. What is it?" "Just a trinket," she answered, dropping it in his palm. "Marrow gave it to me. For luck." She couldn't help but place a sour emphasis on the word. His green eyes flashed to hers for a moment, before he raised it to the light. "It's pretty." He angled it back and forth before tossing it back into her hands. "That was sweet of him, I guess, if he couldn't give us answers." She traced the edges. It had been flushed beneath her fingers, but returned cold as ice. "Would you like me to put another log on the fire?" she offered, eyeing him with a trace of concern. "You must be freezing." "Kiera!" Her heart stopped as her eyes shot to the tent. For a split second, she couldn't bear to see what might be inside, but she scrambled to her feet, racing forward. "I'm coming!" The door pulled back, and she slid to a stop. Eden smiled. "You look terrible." She let out a breath of laughter, then another. Then she covered her mouth, holding back a tired sob. Jessie wandered up carefully behind her, letting out a quiet sigh of relief. "The fever has broken." Evander turned to them with a glowing smile, looking like someone had brought him back from the grave. "The danger has passed." "As I said it would." Eden shook with a cough, pushing higher onto the bed. "My people are blessed with a godlike resilience. There was never any need for alarm." The vampire reached over swiftly to help him. "Evan, I am fine." "Evan?" Evander helped him anyway, propping him against the pillows, before pushing abruptly to his feet. "I'm going to get more flowers in case the fever comes back. He will need more water as well, though he doesn't like to drink it." The men shared a hard look. "You must persuade him." Unsurprisingly, Jessie volunteered to fetch the water. "You will be here when I return?" the vampire asked, squeezing the Fae's hand. It was the same question he'd asked each morning when they'd first begun traveling together, terrified his new companions would flee each time he left to hunt. Eden gazed up with a tender smile. "Where else would I go?" The vampire kissed him swiftly, a hand cupped around his head, then vanished swiftly out the door, but not before leaving his beloved with a parting threat. "Let me be perfectly clear. You may never die," he said bluntly. "I forbid it. There will never be a good enough reason. There will never be a worthy enough cause. If you should ever decide to try," he continued, pacing back across the tent, "if you get any more clever ideas in that pretty little head, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth, and I will kill you again myself." They locked eyes. Then the vampire kissed him again. "Drink your water." He was gone a moment later, leaving a chilling silence in his wake. Kiera stared after him, not at all surprised to discover her feet had locked to the ground. She took a second to detach them, then settled herself beside the Fae. Not sweet. The tension vanished as both remembered their conversation outside Farion. She had wondered as to his lack of attraction. He had claimed to have a certain type. Eden laughed softly, then his face grew still. "He is, actually." His eyes lifted to hers. "Is that strange?" She considered a moment. "It's just people, right?" He smiled again, nodding. "It's just people." They sat there quietly for a while, thinking of where the day had started, thinking of where it had ended up. After a few seconds of silence, he lifted his gaze.
"Did you bring it?"
She opened her cloak to show the dagger underneath. A peculiar expression stole across his features, something like an anticipation, something like grief. In the end, it was merely grateful.
"Thank you."
She nodded and slipped beneath his arm. The blade passed between them, sheathing itself safe in the Fae's belt. She tried not to think of it. She tried not to think of anything. A few more seconds passed, and she started to cry. Chapter 11. The Fae slept through the next day, through the next night, and late again into the next morning. His friends took advantage of the opportunity to gather supplies. There wasn't much coin left after their series of misadventures, but there was plenty that could be traded the next time they found themselves in a town. The river people were said to make their living primarily through bargaining with outsiders. They would have such fundamentals as shelter and food, but they might be lacking in certain things found higher in the mountains. Walnuts and mushrooms were stuffed deep into satchels. Honey and fresh juices were stored in the empty flasks. There was apparently an expensive oil that could be made by pressing the leaves of a certain alpine flower, though for the life of her, Kiera couldn't manage it. But she was able to find a grove of red sander, which was nearly as pricey, valued for its vibrant color and dyes. By the time they returned to camp, Eden had strayed from the tent and was highly offended to have found himself deserted in his hour of need. He was proceeding to make this well known.
"I'd like to personally thank whoever decided to put the bandages at the very bottom of a pack," he snapped. "Searching for it has been a great therapy for my recently mangled hand."
The rest of them kept their eyes wisely on their own tasks, knowing better by now than to engage. It had been another wise idea to confiscate the Fae's weapons before he'd awoken.
"No, don't bother helping,"
he continued irritably. "I'll get it myself." He let out a deafening sigh, cradling his injured hand safe against his chest, while the other rifled through the satchel. There was a clumsiness to each movement that hadn't been there before the fever. When his finger caught upon the handle, the whole thing tumbled into the flames. "The pack is in the fire now," he updated them casually. "Jesse, I believe it was yours." Kiera watched as the shifter hurried forward, grabbing the handle and scooping it away from the coals. His own hand ached desperately for a blade, but he flashed the Fae a saccharine smile instead, sweeping the ash from his belongings and relocating into the nearby trees. "Smart." The Fae sulked a moment at the lack of opposition, then continued to search for something to trim the gauze. When he failed to find anything, he proceeded to loudly demand his blades. She slipped to the other side of the vampire, careful not to present herself as a target. "Oh, this is going to be delightful." "What do you expect?" Evander answered shortly. "He's Fae. They're dramatic, impulsive, and hot-tempered. There can be no reasoning with one in a time like this." She nodded slowly, flashing a secret smile. "Dramatic, impulsive, and hot-tempered. Not like vampires. The vampires I know aren't like that at all." He looked at her in surprise. "Are you teasing me, Kiera?" She froze, suddenly panicked. "Would that be so terrible?" He stared a second longer before returning to his task. "I'm just amazed you think that's a good idea." They continued working in silence, one passing over tiny slices of lemon as the other squeezed them slowly into a jar. It was a thankless task, but one that kept them clear of the fray. It also permitted them to watch. Eden could make all the snappish jokes he wanted, but Kiera truly didn't know why he didn't spend every second screaming, given the state of his hand. The bones had been reset, but the lean muscles and delicate tendons were still torn straight through the middle. When the Fae had tried to fit an arrow to his bow the day before, he'd doubled over in excruciating pain. She watched him for a moment, then cast Evander a tentative look. "I've heard the blood of vampires has healing properties." For weeks now, she'd wanted to ask him directly. It was nothing but idle gossip, things she'd picked up from travellers passing through the tavern. But like most such things, there was often a shred of truth at the core. And if something like that were true, it raised several more questions. He glanced down at her with a touch of surprise, then returned his eyes to the Fae. "My blood cannot heal him," he murmured quietly, as if he'd wished that it could many times before. "We are too different, he and I." She studied him curiously, surprised by his tone. "You don't seem so different to me." The ghost of a smile flitted across his face, vanishing just as fast. "That is because you are young," he answered, his knife curving the peel off the fruit. "If you had been alive as long as I have—" He trailed away. "I wish very much it were true." They passed the lemons between them, working into an easy rhythm, one cut and the other crushed, over and over, as the little jar slowly filled to the top. It was sour now. That was how it would travel, but soon the people who traded for it would sweeten the bitterness away. She replayed his last words, unable to let it rest. "I don't understand that," she finally murmured. "You claim to be so different, yet Eden cares for you all the same." "And that surprises you?" the vampire asked sharply, turning to face her. "Why, because he is better than me, because I cannot have something so good." She lowered her hands in surprise. "Is that what he says?" There was a pause. "No," the vampire admitted. "He says exactly the opposite." Another pause, doubtful this time. "He says we are the same," Evander clarified, speaking in a sudden rush, each word chasing after the next. "He says the past has little bearing on the present, and that—" He quieted suddenly, staring into the fire. "He says a great many things." Another day passed, and the friends continued hiking, albeit at a slower pace. At least that was the intent. "Could you just walk like a normal person?" Evander chided for the 10th time. "You are making everyone nervous. Could you just walk upon the trail?" Eden swept past with a radiant smile, pressing a loud kiss to his cheek. The extra day's rest had done wonders, and the Fae was starting to feel very much like his old self, restless and charismatic, and playful as all hell. He had been expressing this like a child with 3 days of pent-up energy. He had also decided to take the vampire's warnings as a challenge. "Slow down," Evander repeated fiercely, "or I will force you." "Best of luck with that," Jesse remarked, watching as the Fae vanished up ahead before reappearing a moment later with a clutch of blackberries in his hand. He popped 2 into his mouth, then gave the rest to Kiera. "We've tried for months and never had any luck." The vampire ground his jaw in frustration. "You do not have fangs." There was a beat of silence. "That's a good point." Their hair blew forward as the Fae doubled back again, thinking he might have dropped something, before shifting momentum and shooting back up the trail. Evander's hand flew out to catch him, but even he was not fast enough. He glowered instead, staring in exasperation. "Stop bounding ahead like that. You are poisoned. You must rest." Eden froze abruptly, turning on a dime. "You were poisoned. You must rest." The others stopped as well, choking down laughter as he slipped into a frightfully accurate impression of the vampire's voice. He was mimicking him as well, arms folded with a little scowl. Evander was stunned. Never had he seen such a thing. "What are you doing? What are you doing?" He unfolded his arms. "This is foolishness, Eden. I haven't the time for games." "I haven't the time for games." Evander nodded slowly, eyes narrowing with a rather frightening expression. Eden turned even more slowly to glance behind him. Seeing nothing, he lifted a hand to his chest in surprise. Me? The vampire stood there a second longer, then shot forward like an arrow and tackled the Fae around the waist. It might have been terrifying if Eden weren't laughing uncontrollably all the while. That being said, it still carried a few of those harrowing qualities, particularly when the vampire grew tired of tumbling and simply pinned him violently to the ground. All right, the Fae surrendered with a breathless grin. I'll take this more seriously. He dropped his head to the ground, suddenly dizzy.
I'll take this more seriously.
Evander studied him with concern. You need to rest. We should not have left so soon. The Fae studied him in return, tracing a finger along the shadows beneath his eyes. And you need to hunt. He turned his head to the side, exposing his neck. Take some from me. The vampire only smiled, smoothing back his hair. You must gather your strength, he replied. You have none to spare for me. And besides, you are likely still touched with madness. It would explain a great deal. He leaned back on his heels. But I will hunt. It was difficult to be around the Fae in the best of circumstances. It had been significantly harder when parts of him were constantly soaked in blood. Could we stop here for the night? He asked the others, gesturing to a break in the trees just a little ways off the trail. The three of you could eat something as well. They hadn't been walking very long. It was just after midday, but there was a good chance the vampire was right about Eden pushing things too quickly. He'd yet to rise from the ground. Yes, that's fine. Jesse swung the pack off his shoulders, glancing around for the best place to pitch the tent. It had become somewhat a transient ritual, a temporary hoisting of a flag, before moving somewhere new. We've used so many flasks, I need to refill our water anyway. He cut a line westward before he'd even finished speaking, hearing the distant splash of a river, while the girl standing beside him could not. She took his pack instead, grabbing it from his arm before dragging out the heavy canvas and maneuvering it between two trees. Evander started a fire with a few quick sweeps of his hand. Eden was already sitting beside it. We are getting good at this. Much better than we were before.
Wait a moment.
The Fae spoke up suddenly, playing the words in his mind.
You cannot hunt in these parts. What if other animals are sick? Those flowers would not heal you the same.
The vampire gave him a habitual kiss on the forehead, setting off anyway. I'll be fine. I can read the signs. No, he's right, Kiera interrupted, heaving the last of the poles into place. The beast that attacked before was already close to the end. It was obvious, but many others could be infected with the same thing, and you would never know it. He's right, Evander. We should get farther away. The vampire hovered impatiently at the edge of the clearing. What then? No, I cannot drink from you, he repeated, as the Fae beckoned him closer. You are in no condition, and I must hunt, Eden. It has been too long already. He considered a moment, then let out a sigh. It will have to be from one of them. Kieran nodded along, then went very still. Wait, what? The vampire was already moving towards her, freezing the blood in her veins. A reflexive cry rose up in her throat, but she could give no air to it. Was such a thing even permitted? He was the vampire no longer. He was Evander, her companion, possibly even her friend. Were screams no longer an option? Must she indulge him now instead? A figure appeared between them. Eden had risen swiftly from the fire.
That will not happen,
he said firmly. Evander paused in surprise. But you said...
I said you should not drink from the animals of the forest, as they could still be touched with madness. I said that if you wish, you are welcome to drink from me. Kiera is not an option.
His eyes said a great deal more. Back off. Not since those first days had there been such open hostility between them. The vampire didn't know what to make of it now, but he chose a troublesome path. You know it will do no lasting harm. I need blood, Eden.
You need to wait, the Fae countered, looking abruptly tired. The answer is not that you frighten and take from a defenseless girl. If you will not drink from me, then wait. The vampire considered a moment, then shook his head. You are not thinking clearly. He took a step forward, shocked again when the Fae stood in his way. What is this? He challenged, eyes flashing. You would send me away? Eden stepped right in front of him, staring into his face. I'll stop you, Evander. He was utterly expressionless, utterly calm. That playful boy from the woods had vanished, replaced with the immortal warrior who'd defended her since the day they'd left Farion. 1,000 snarling terrors had tested him. Not a single one had found a path. The vampire wasn't angry, as she might have expected. He couldn't seem to get past the surprise. Twice his eyes flickered towards Kiera, tightening around the edges, as though struck with a problem he'd never considered before. When they returned to the Fae, the answer was clear. I'm sorry, he said abruptly, looking past Eden to the girl cowering behind. I did not mean to frighten you, or take what is not mine. I am just thirsty. And I am a person, she answered softly, still rattled beyond belief. He nodded slowly, not quite following. That's very convenient. That's what I eat. Eden's hand twitched towards his blade, but she caught his wrist, stepping carefully around him until she and Evander were standing face to face. Oddly enough, it was the vampire's confusion that had steadied her. There was no animosity, no malice. It had simply never occurred to him not to bite her. They were venturing into uncharted territory. Everything was brand new. If we were friendly with another vampire, she began quietly, if we let him come into our camp, would you let him feed upon Eden? Evander hissed involuntarily. Absolutely not. He is mine. The Fae glanced up sharply behind her, not exactly pleased with the vernacular, but he kept his silence. He even allowed her to take a step closer, in reach of the vampire's quick hands. But we're all friends, she countered. We all share. A Fae is a vampire's food, just as much as any mortal. Probably even more. What would be so wrong in it? A muscle twitched in Evander's jaw. They wouldn't be able to stop. I don't wish to speak of it. What if they could stop? She pressed gently, staring up at him. What if they could stop, but they never asked his permission? What if they just grabbed him and fed? She paused, letting the visual take hold. Perhaps Eden would have to patrol that night, or hike the next day for many hours. Perhaps we'd be attacked, and he'd be too tired to fight. Perhaps he simply didn't wish it. She paused again, staring into the vampire's eyes. Would it seem convenient to you then? The two regarded each other in charged silence, one that wasn't exactly antagonistic, but there was something pressing about it at the same time. As long as she lived, she'd never be able to interpret the vampire's expression. Those dark eyes were overwhelming, brimming with such feeling that it seemed to spill right out of him and consume them both. If that silence had lasted any longer, she might have asked him what it was, but she never got the chance. There was a rustling in the trees, then Jesse appeared beside them. You must come, he said breathlessly. I've found the people we're looking for. Chapter 12. The river people, as Kiera had heard them repeatedly described, were nothing like what she'd come to expect. To start, they didn't live by a river. The friends had passed by one on the way down the slopes, according to Eden. They'd passed several, but the village itself was just a village. I don't understand, she whispered as they ventured onto a bluff. Where is all the water? Jesse threw her a quick smile, then hoisted her onto his shoulders. 7 hells! Her eyes lit up, and she let out a gasp of surprise, staring in open-mouthed wonder at the tangle of sunlit ribbons stretching out towards the sky. There were so many, there couldn't possibly be names for all of them.
Some were wider than others. Some were choppy, some calm. All of them reminded her of something, a vague image in the periphery. She couldn't quite place what it was. "It's like veins," she blurted suddenly. "They lace the valley like veins." The shifter nodded, his dark hair brushing her legs. "And the village is right at the heart. There are several," he continued, striding alongside the others as they left the trees and ventured onto the grassy plains. "But from what I've been told, the largest is at the center. People travel between the others by boat, looking for things to trade." He shot a confirmatory glance at Eden, who nodded in agreement. "It's a sprawling place with sprawling people." The Fae lifted a hand to shield his eyes from the setting sun. "The perfect spot to travel unnoticed, should one ever wish to hide." It was easy to believe it. Amidst the tangle of rivers, each one peppered with little hamlets, it was easy to imagine how someone could get lost and never return. It wasn't until the others had already started moving that Kiera understood the silent warning in his words. "He's worried for Jesse. He's worried he might be found." "The river people are descended from men," he continued lightly, "but there are several packs in the area as well. Might any of them have a connection to yours?" Jesse stiffened beneath her, rigid as a blade. "We're too far away," he replied, without much conviction. When the others looked at him, he shrugged it off with a casual smile. "It will be fine, trust me." Kiera hopped back to the ground, giving his shoulders a quick squeeze. Not for the first time, she wondered if Eden had told the shifter's secret to Evander. Probably. The two were always talking, and while it wasn't in the Fae's character to break a confidence, the fact that their fellowship had been casually avoiding the vengeance of a wolf pack wasn't the kind of thing to keep to oneself. "Come then," Eden said softly. "The sun is setting. We must find a place to stay the night." It didn't take long to reach the central hub amidst the web of rivers. The trails were flat and well worn, thick with the scent of papyrus rustling in the breeze. "Oh, look," Evander said with an ironic smile. "There's so much hyacinth." The vampire had run himself ragged, trying to collect enough to fight the fever gripping the Fae. Only a few blossoms it had yielded, and he'd run straight through his shoes. Jesse flashed a teasing grin. "Should have gone this way, I guess." The vampire lifted his eyebrows. "Are those wolves behind you?" The shifter tensed in spite of himself, casting a reflexive look over his shoulder. By the time he glanced back, Evander was staring with a wry smile. "My mistake. Just some dogs." "Well, that settles that." Eden rolled his eyes, pushing between them to continue down the trail. He made sure to knock into Evander's shoulder as he walked past. "Play nice with the children." The vampire shrugged stiffly. "He started it." The village itself was much the same as any other. There was a school and a blacksmith, a butcher and baker, apothecaries and taverns. The houses were a bit smaller, set farther into the reeds. Along one side ran a great forest, while the other opened onto water. So wide and expansive it had looked from the mountains. So perfectly ordinary it was from the valley floor. "We can sell off what we've gathered, then meet back at one of the taverns." Eden pointed to a small pub in the distance, one of the few that wasn't on the main road. "How about there?" The friends agreed and quickly divvied up the supplies between them, each of them setting off in a different direction in search of the best price. For once, there wasn't any need for worry or safety in numbers. As long as they stayed in the village, almost everything was within sight. Kiera sold the honey they'd collected for 3 silver pieces. It would probably have brought much less, but she'd chosen her victim carefully and charmed him with a smile. She returned to the others in triumph, thinking hers would be the greatest achievement, only for the Fae to beat her. The vampire arrived only a moment after, opening his hand with double what the others had brought. "That's impossible!" Jesse exclaimed, balking in astonishment at the gold twinkling in his palm.
Weren't you bartering for the flint? That was the cheapest thing we had."
"I thought we might use the flint," Evander answered casually. "I didn't sell it." The others froze at the same time, unwilling to ask the question. After a few seconds, they shoved Kiera forward as sacrifice, elbowing her at the same time.
"Then where did you get the gold?"
The vampire glanced up in surprise, having thought the conversation had already finished.
"Oh, I asked for it."
There was a beat of silence, followed by 3 matching smiles.
"Of course you did."
If a vampire asks for money, you can be damn sure he'll come back with gold. They headed towards the tavern without a backward glance, clapping Evander on the shoulder as they passed. He was looking between them in confusion, before holding up the gold.
"Was that wrong?"
Needless to say, the friends had more than enough coin for the tavern. Still, they were cautious with their spending, having learned their lesson before. They paid for a single room on the upper story and settled inside with their sparse belongings. A small bed was set in the corner. The window opened onto a tiny balcony from which they could see the main road.
"It feels strange to be inside after so long,"
Kiera murmured, perching on the edge of the mattress. The floorboards were deafening under her boots, while the blankets seemed abnormally soft. She smoothed them slowly beneath her fingers.
"We'll have to fight it out for this."
Eden glanced across the room with a grin. "I think Evander has earned it, don't you? Seeing as he could probably buy the village several times over." The others chuckled, but the vampire looked thoughtfully towards the bed.
"I've never slept in a bed before," he murmured. "Not that I can remember. Perhaps only once. I was hunting and came across an old couple near Vale. There was one in their house."
In hindsight, it was entirely possible he didn't realize the weight of what he was saying. Such things were natural to a vampire, the same as the confrontation in the woods a few hours before, and it was entirely possible he would never have known, but his eyes flashed up when the face stiffened.
"Do you not wish to tell you such things?" he asked quietly.
Eden drew in a breath, then continued unpacking. "I wish you to tell me everything." It might have been true, or merely a way to avoid the conversation, but the Fae was suddenly in a hurry to leave the room. He abandoned the packs and swept almost immediately for the door. "Come, let's get a drink." The tavern was laid out almost identically to everywhere they'd stayed before, with chambers on the upper levels and a common gathering room on the ground floor. The friends avoided sitting at the bar, the heart of the chaos, and settled in a ring of chairs around the fire. They were clearly coveted, but between the Fae and the vampire, no one dared to approach. They were able to relax in relative peace, sipping drinks and watching those around them. Considering the size of the valley, it wasn't a varied clientele. Most of the people had clearly descended from men, as Eden had said before, but there were quite a few shifters. Kiera was both surprised and pleased that she was able to recognize them, even without the extra senses of her magical friends. Perhaps it was because they moved so much like Jesse did himself. Fluid but assertive, confident, with surprisingly quick hands.
"We should have gotten a second room."
Her cheeks flamed with a sudden blush, although she hadn't said a word out loud. Yet her eyes strayed to the armchairs across the fire, thinking the others might not be opposed themselves. Even when the vampire and the Fae weren't together, they were never apart. When one reached for something, the other had it waiting. When one leaned forward, the other eased back. It was like they were tied by some invisible string, always moving in tandem with one another. There was something about it that seemed almost private, though it couldn't help but draw Kiera's eyes. It felt very much like what the vampire had said. To witness such tenderness was a gift. Even now they had drawn their chairs together, indifferent to the eyes of the room. Eden was tracing the rim of his glass, watching some men play dice on the other side of the room, while Evander was reclining with an arm draped loosely over his shoulders. His eyes drifted aimlessly as he stroked a finger along the shell of the Fae's ear, tapping lightly against the point. Kiera followed the movement jealously, having wanted to do the exact same thing many times herself. She was about to make a joke to that effect, when the vampire looked suddenly towards her.
"He is mine."
Within a second, the temperature seemed to spike several hundred degrees. Kiera stared in shock, thinking he must be joking, or she had somehow misheard. But a single look at the vampire's face told her otherwise. His arm tightened territorially, and those dark eyes burned into hers with exactly as much silent intensity as she'd been watching them with just a moment before. "No, I wasn't," she stammered, shaking her head in confusion. I was just..." But as fate would have it, the fight would not be hers.
"What was that?"
Eden leaned forward, a dangerous smile playing about his face. Evander's arm fell to the chair behind him as the two locked eyes.
"I must have misheard."
It was the second time he'd used that particular phrase, and the Fae was still having trouble letting go of the first. The others flushed awkwardly, but the vampire was completely unabashed.
"You are mine," he said plainly. "It is nothing but the truth."
Eden nodded slowly, never breaking his gaze.
"Yours," he repeated, with a chilling smile. "Like a horse or a pocket watch. Something with slightly higher value, I'd hope. Something belonging to you."
The vampire watched in silence as he pushed to his feet.
"The next time you feel tempted to say something like that," he continued softly, "to reduce me to property, something owned, I want you to think about a horse or a pocket watch." He gave the vampire a parting look. "Then I want you to strike yourself in the face." The chair pushed back loudly as Eden stormed across the tavern, flinging open the door and slamming it behind him. The sound was lost in the clamour, but the friends flinched all the same. Evander was merely lost, staring after him.
"What must I do now?"
There was something so completely bewildered about him in moments like this, that despite the strange accusation, the others couldn't help but feel the slightest bit protective. Of a vampire. How the world had changed. Jesse leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms above his head. "You must apologize." The vampire let out a breath, pushing slowly to his feet. The last few days had been full of such lessons, but each one seemed to end exactly the same.
"You people spend a lot of time apologizing, don't you?"
The shifter flashed a grin. "You have no idea." With a parting nod, the vampire swept quickly across the tavern, vanishing in the same direction as the Fae. The others looked after him, before Jesse pushed to his feet as well. "I'll get us some drinks." Kiera nodded in silence, curling her legs beneath her and staring over the crowd. Unlike most of the other taverns she'd seen, this one bore at least some claim to being a family establishment. As she sat there, a group of shifters wandered down the stairs. There was a man and a woman, along with a high-spirited little boy. The woman kissed the child on the cheek, murmuring something that he dutifully ignored, before his father swept him upon his shoulders. There was a chorus of laughter. Then they slipped further into the crowd. She stared after them for a long time after, watching without realizing, her hand propped up beneath her chin. Not before long, the Fae had asked where she intended to go when the quest was finally completed, and their lives were once again their own. They'd been wandering through a lovely forest. She'd been utterly enchanted, and he'd asked if that's where she might wish to remain. It was a simple enough question, one that most people could have answered without a second thought. But try as she might, she couldn't come up with a single thing to say in reply. "I cannot go home. My home was destroyed." These words at least were familiar. In the weeks following the attack on Catelyn, she used to chant them to herself each night before falling asleep. It had been a way of keeping grounded, a way of reminding herself what had happened, like she could ever forget. A silly little trick, perhaps, but the fire had been too great a thing to hold inside her head. She'd needed a way to make it real. These days, that void had been filled with other things. So many other things. Full days went by without her remembering the smoke. But what happened when those things were gone? The Fae and the vampire would stay together. Of this she had no doubt. Since Eden was physically incapable of holding still, and Evander was physically incapable of leaving him, they would probably wander from one corner of the realm to another, always set on another adventure, always reaching for the other's hand. And what about me? They were falling in love. There was no place for her there. And while the little fellowship may have formed an unlikely bond, the immortals had little in common with a mortal girl. And what about Jesse? Her eyes drifted in the opposite direction, finding him easily in the crowd. For all her years of aimless daydreams, for all her endless questions, she could never have counted on something quite like Jesse. He seemed both the end and the beginning, as if the time in the middle had just been waiting, pining in silence for a person she had never met. They had shared firsts and shared fires. They had fought and reconciled. They had taken up the greatest burden their world had to offer and lifted it together with both hands. He always smiled when he saw her coming. He always made her smile as well. Would he stay with me when this is over? Is that something I even want? Although she had no way of knowing it, the shifter had been rather preoccupied with the same questions himself. He'd finished paying for the drinks and was carrying them back, when an old man tumbled out of nowhere, knocking them precariously in his hands.
"I'm sorry,"
he croaked, grabbing onto the wolf for balance.
"So sorry."
He righted himself a second later, fixing his shirt with a grin.
"Careful with that whiskey, my boy. It catches up to you."
Whiskey. Fantastic. Jessie laughed and slipped past him, rejoining her beside the fire. You need to be more careful, she teased, taking a tankard from his hand. He was about 9,000 years old. You could have killed him. He settled in the adjacent chair. My apologies. He lifted his own glass and they clinked together, proceeding to drink. Rather, she forced herself to drink, while he watched over the rim of his glass with a secret grin. You hate it. I do, she admitted, wiping her mouth. The whiskey had burned all the way down her throat, leaving a scorched trail behind it. I don't know how you can drink that stuff. He leaned forward with a grin and swapped their glasses, drinking deeply, as she stared down in surprise. Juice. He'd gotten juice in preparation for her inevitable judgment. She peered down with a smile, swishing it around. Then, all at once, it slipped from her face. When Eden was caught in the worst of the fever, she began quietly, when he thought that he might... She trailed off for a moment, then lifted her eyes. He asked me to kill him. Jesse turned slowly, his face still with shock. For a few seconds, he was unable to think of anything to say in reply. When he finally managed to speak, the only thing he could do was deny it. He was burning with fever. He did not mean it. He did. She played it back in her mind, fingers drumming maniacally against the glass. Since the Fae had given her a blade and made his request, she'd never really stopped thinking about it. No matter how many days had passed, no matter how well the remedy had worked, not for a single instant had it fully left her mind. It was something she hadn't realized until that very moment. She spoke quickly now, like she needed to purge the thoughts from her mind. He handed me a knife and told me to do it swiftly. He showed me where. He said Evander would stay with us afterward, see our journey through to the end. He wouldn't, Jessie interrupted, turning to stare across the tavern. It is the thing I fear most, the narrow scope of the vampire's sentiment. He would stay for Eden, not for us. She leaned back with a touch of surprise, worried to discover a part of her agreed. You heard what he said after we found the glass village. He committed himself to our cause, but his feeling for Eden grows with each sunrise. He would be broken if anything were to happen. I believe the world could burn down around him, and he wouldn't notice until it was gone. Again, she agreed. They turned their minds to other things, deliberately letting the subject rest. Glasses were lifted and slowly drained. The fire crackled loud and warm beside them. It was a long while before either of them spoke again.
Jess, can I ask you something about the binding?
He glanced over in surprise, having been staring unblinkingly into the fire. Of course. She coloured with a preemptive blush, fingers twisting nervously inside her sleeves.
It's not like...
The words caught in her throat, and she took a breath to steady herself, flashing him a quick look.
It's not like a marriage, is it? Or a proposal?
His lips parted in amazement. Why on earth would you think that? Her blush deepened even further, like crushed berries.
I didn't really. It's just... You said that your parents had done it, and every other couple, and it happened so quickly that I never really asked you what it's supposed to mean.
She certainly felt what it was supposed to mean. She'd felt it every day since it happened, but she wanted to hear him say it, in his own words. Then maybe she could find the words herself. Sure enough, he didn't disappoint. It means you have a piece of me, he said simply, and you have it forever, whether we stay in each other's lives or find ourselves drifting apart. You have changed me in a way that can't be undone, in a way I would never wish to be undone. He opened his mouth to say more, then closed it with a little smile. It was your birthday. I wanted to give you something in return. Her pulse steadied, then quickened. That blush spread over her like wildfire, igniting the rest of her skin, and, for whatever reason, she found herself looking again at his hands.
Say something. Say something in return.
Oh. Her eyes snapped shut as the tiny voice inside her head went sour. Well done. Minutes crawled by as they sat there in silence, though neither was as distracted as they'd been before. Quite the contrary. Each one was hyper-aware of the other. Each one was playing back every word that had just been spoken, wondering at better things they might have said instead. After a deceptively long while, he flashed a sudden grin. You thought I had proposed? He asked, shaking with silent laughter. And as a wolf, no less. You thought I had proposed without speaking, and then just not told you? He bit his lip as that laughter threatened to break free. Like I was hoping you wouldn't notice we were engaged. Every word might have been true, but she refused to admit it.
You are famously self-centered, she countered stiffly. I would expect nothing else.
Their eyes met, warming with a shared smile. A second later, he pulled their chairs closer together, reaching for her hand. If we're being honest, I'm actually glad you said something. His fingers traced the length of hers before lacing themselves in between. Ever since that day, I've regretted the way that it happened. It was so abrupt, I didn't really know how to explain. His eyes drifted to the window, lingering a moment in the dark. It isn't easy to feel the way I feel for you, to say the things I wish to say when we're always in the company of other people. He shivered suddenly, like he was fighting off a chill. I believe in what we're doing, but sometimes I wish that it was already. He lifted slowly to his feet, eyes fixed upon the window. Kiera, do you... The glass slipped from his hands, shattering into 100 pieces. 7 hells! Chapter 13. Jesse did not stop to explain before racing from the tavern. He also didn't stop for people. He'd stood there a second longer, like a bird poised on the verge of flight. Then, without a hint of warning, he sprinted straight through the crowd, leaving the glass clattering behind him. Kiera jumped in her skin, staring after him in shock. It took a second for her wits to return,
Then she took off after him, apologizing desperately to everyone he'd shoved out of the way.
It can't be a dragon. More people would be screaming if it was the dragon.
Her mind spun with 100 terrifying prospects as she knocked her way clumsily to the door, each one even worse than the last. So many creatures they'd faced in the span of only a few weeks, so many nightmares to choose from. It might have been a Glycerin or a troll. It might have been another company of Carpathians, or maybe his old pack had found him after all. She slid to a breathless stop behind him, prepared for anything. But she could never have guessed the next thing that came out of his mouth.
Emery!
The shifter was standing right in front of her, trembling head to toe. His whole body was screaming, but he could manage nothing more than a whisper, staring in astonishment at the trees. He turned around a second later, breathless tears sliding down his face.
I cannot believe it. My brother is alive.
Kiera stared at Jessie. Then she stared into the shadows behind him. There was nothing there. His shouts had carried, and soon other people poured curiously out of the tavern, staring at him strangely and talking behind cupped hands. The shifter never saw him. His eyes were only for his brother, the one who had been murdered in the middle of childhood only a year before.
It's all right. Nothing will harm you now. It's just me.
He took a faltering step closer, reaching out a hand.
Why do you hide in the shadows? Come here. Let me see you.
His skin was so pale, it looked cold to the touch. His voice was so tender, it tore at Kiera's heart. She stood rigid behind him, flying through the last few days in her mind. He wasn't touched by the cougar. They'd eaten none of the meat. He hadn't even moved it off the trail. They had left it frothing where it lay. And yet... Eden and Evander appeared a second later, drawn by the noise.
What is it? The Fae asked quickly. What happened?
She turned to him stricken.
It's his brother, she whispered, clutching at his sleeve. He thinks...
Eden! Jessie was overjoyed, gesturing him forward.
Come and meet someone. This is my brother, Emery. I cannot understand what happened. I was so sure.
He trailed into silence, unwilling to say anything more. There was no longer a need. His sweet brother had been returned to him, wearing the same smile, wearing the same clothes. The Fae stepped cautiously forward.
Jessie, I cannot see him.
What? What do you mean you cannot see him? The shifter was so breathless with elation, he actually laughed. He is standing right before you. Have you gone blind? Kiera cupped a hand over her mouth, tears spilling down her own cheeks as well. How cruel are the gods! He will not get through this a second time. Eden stepped even closer, resting a gentle hand upon the wolf's arm.
I cannot see him, he repeated softly. Are you looking at him now?
The second the men touched, everything shattered apart. The illusion vanished, and whatever the shifter had been staring at, whatever had made him so desperately happy, disappeared. He blinked quickly, and a chill came over his face. His eyes flew back to the forest, searching. Emery? He took a step forward, reaching his hand into the air like they might touch. I don't understand. His voice swelled in volume, then fell to a whisper. He was right here. Eden threw a quick glance over his shoulder, and Evander spoke a few short words to the crowd. A few short words was all you'd ever need from a vampire. Without a pause, they began to disperse, heads bowed in deferential silence, melting into doorways and easing into shops. The Fae circled slowly to face him, 6 careful steps.
Jessie, are you...
Don't touch me, the shifter cried, reeling away from him. Don't say anything. He staggered back with a dry sob, clutching his chest as wild tears flew off his face.
The other hand he raised like a shield between them, trembling so hard he could hardly keep it up.
"I am not mad, Eden,"
he shouted, painfully aware that's exactly something a person touched by madness might say.
"Don't you dare touch me. I know what you asked of Kiera. I know what you made her promise to do. You will not do the same to me."
Without another word, he took off running straight back to the tavern, bypassing the main chamber altogether and leaping up the stairs. He didn't stop moving until he was back in their room. They heard the door slam from outside.
"What in 7 hells just happened?" "What is he talking about?" Evander asked quietly. "What did you make her promise to do?"
The Fae visibly stiffened as Kiera braced beside him.
"We will speak on it later,"
he answered, eyes drifting up to the tavern windows. They were all lit with candles, glowing from within, all except one.
"Right now, we have bigger problems."
The three friends climbed the stairs together, ghosting down the hallway, only to find the door was already unlocked. They pushed it open and saw the shifter sitting on the side of the bed. They had been relieved that he'd headed for the tavern. It would have been quite another thing to track down a wolf in the woods, perhaps even impossible given his state of mind. But looking at him now, that relief vanished on the spot. The coals were still smouldering in the hearth from the remains of a fire, heating the room almost unbearably. But despite how close he sat, Jesse was trembling. His skin was shock pale, damp with a faint sheen, as though a fever had lifted, and his roving eyes had fixed upon a single spot.
"How can we help him? How does one come back from such a thing?"
Kiera pulled in a breath, then sat down beside him, lifting a gentle hand and placing it on his back. He was cold, but hot at the same time. She rubbed slow circles, wondering how she would react to the sudden appearance of Talbot or Marcel, or anyone else from her village. If she was being honest, she'd probably faint on the spot.
"When my brother died, in those days afterwards, I saw him."
His voice was quiet, yet it still carried. The others exchanged a quick glance, surprised he could even speak. Kiera leaned closer and mimicked his posture, both arms resting on her knees.
"Like a ghost?" she asked softly. "Or a dream?"
He shook his head. "The same as I'm seeing you now." His hands were still shaking, clenched into fists. There would be flashes of him in a window, glimpses of his face in a crowd. Sometimes when I'd turn, he would still be there, just for a moment, but he would be there until the moment he was not. Like the flicker of a dream, she remembered what he told her in the days just after they'd met, about how he understood how it felt to have a story that other people wouldn't believe. She'd been curious at the time, but her head was still spinning with the dragon. She'd always framed their meeting like that, thinking what a strange point it had been in her own life. Not until that very moment did she realize what a point it had been in his. Eden nodded slowly, settling on the ground by his knees. Perhaps it was merely to listen. Perhaps it was a casual way to ensure his friend didn't shift after all and vanish into the woods without a trace.
"Tell me more."
Jesse flashed him a quick look and wiped brusquely at his cheeks, coming back to himself enough to look self-conscious for the first time. "What's the point? You already think I'm crazy."
"I do not think you're crazy,"
the Fae replied immediately, placing careful emphasis on each of the words.
"I do not think it. Many years I've wandered this place, and many people I have lost. Each one is different, leaving its own mark. Who am I to say what you saw?"
He hesitated a brief moment, then added,
"I can only tell you I did not see him myself."
The shifter drew in a deep breath, hands clenched on his knees. "This time it was different," he said quietly.
It was not merely a glimpse of him. He didn't appear, then vanish. This time he stayed. His voice seemed to ache with the words, picking up speed. The entire time I ran through the tavern, I could see him through the glass. His face wasn't fixed. It brightened when he saw me. He was excited, I think. He started to raise his hand. He trailed into silence, looking down at his own. Kiera slipped hers inside. "Tell me what you need," she whispered. "Tell me what I can do." He sat there a second longer, then bowed his head to his chest. "Stay." After what felt like an eternity, Kiera left Jessie in the bedroom, staring vacantly at the wall. He had wanted her in the beginning, but he didn't want her by the end. He didn't seem to want anything. Not the fire, not to sleep, only a little boy who wasn't there anymore. She'd kissed him on the cheek before heading down the stairs. Her arms ached from holding them at such an angle, and there was a pulsing throb in her leg. She reached down to rub it, hands slipping into her pocket, only to realize it wasn't an ache, but a burn. The stone that had been resting upon it was hot to the touch. Frightfully hot. She pulled it out with a frown, turning it over slowly. Was I pressing it on it somehow? Or was I too near the embers of the fire? The sound of quiet voices roused her, and she slipped it back into her cloak. Eden and Evander were standing in the middle of the tavern floor, a place that had been graciously deserted after the vampire's pointed words. They had not yet noticed her. From the sound of things, they were having a similar conversation to the one she'd had with herself.
"And he didn't touch the cougar?" Eden asked for the third time. "Not even a scratch?"
Evander gave the same reply. "I was not looking."
"He wouldn't have touched it," the Fae muttered, answering his own question. "And he didn't find anything when you sent him into the woods? Nothing that might have—"
"He would have told us, and that was days ago," the vampire interrupted softly. "It would have taken him by now." He reached a hand between them, resting on the Fae's arm. "Eden, there was no blood on him when he returned. I would have known. This must have been something else." Kiera stepped loudly into the room, and two heads snapped up.
"How is he?"
Eden asked immediately. A flash of Jessie's face drifted through her mind. "Not well. Have you gotten any—" She saw the fresh mud on his boots and looked up in surprise. "You checked for him? You checked the forest?"
Eden flushed, raking back his hair. "I could not in good conscience tell him I didn't check. You know what they say of death. It is always hardest on those left behind."
She nodded faintly and turned to the vampire, expecting him to impart some wisdom. He was an expert on such things after all, but that wisdom fell remarkably short. "Death is cold," he said flatly. "There is little else to the matter." Eden's eyes flicked guiltily towards him, but the vampire stared right ahead. "That must have been a fun conversation you two had." "I don't know what to do for him," she said bluntly. "I don't know what can be done." Ironically enough, it seemed a much harder fix than any of the fantastical problems that had plagued them before. There had been a woman in her village who'd kept seeing flashes of her dead daughter. After a few months of weeping, she'd thrown herself down the well.
"There is nothing that can be done,"
Eden admitted, casting a look up the stairs.
"At least no comfort that I've ever felt. We can be there for him, we can hold his hand."
He let out a tired sigh, shaking his head.
"Perhaps if we found out what triggered the memory this night, it might be of some use to him."
The door pushed open, but none of them noticed. They were too distracted by their own conversation to hear the frantic hush of voices coming from the stairs. It wasn't until a person called loudly out across the tavern they realized they were no longer alone. "Kiera!" The Fae looked up surprised, but it was not spoken in the common tongue, but his own. Loosely translated, it meant teacher, but over the years it had come to mean so much more.
mentor, counselor, guardian. It was one of the first words every child of the realm was taught to say. The second he turned, a group of people rushed towards them, boots scuffing against the floor. There were maybe half a dozen shifters by the look of them. All were wearing the same stricken expression. All were looking at the Fae as though he was a miracle sent down to earth. "Please, you must help us." There was no slowing of speed as one group collided with the other. One of the men cast off from the rest and threw himself forward, grabbing Eden by the cloak. He clung on the way a child held to its mother, utterly immune to the murderous-looking vampire standing by his side. "You must help us," he gasped again, tears and sweat pouring down his cheeks. "It is my son. He is missing. All day we have been searching, and I cannot find my son." The man was quickly replaced by a woman, just as distraught. She looked older than the Fae by several decades, but immortality had a way of erasing such things. She grasped onto his sleeves. "Please," she whispered, while her husband shouted, "You are our last hope." The Fae tensed in a way only his friends would ever notice. It was not the first time he'd been given such a request, but it was most certainly the first time the others had ever seen it. There was a reckless havoc, almost a selfish way, in the way they threw themselves upon him, like he was a celestial parachute and not a living, breathing man. Not until later would Kiera realize she had approached him much the same way. No wonder they wished to lock themselves away in cities. There is nothing more exhausting than to carry another's hope. He took a step back, lifting a subtle hand between them. "Peace, friends. Tell me what happened." They told a story old as time, the same as so many countless others. Their child had gone for a walk in the forest, as he so often did. Just a quick walk before breakfast, then they would get on with the day. They were going to the lakefront to visit family, and that part didn't matter. He went for a walk in the forest, and he never returned. All day they had been searching. The boy was gone. "Now you see, you have to help us." The father stood up from where Eden had made them sit beside the fire, reaching back down and half pulling the Fae to his feet. "There isn't a moment to be wasted. The sun is already set." Evander's cool hand appeared on his wrist. "Let go of his cloak," he said softly. The man blinked in surprise, looking down at his own hands. He hadn't realized that he'd grabbed the Fae. He released him in a daze. Again, his wife stepped forward. "There were many travelling along the road with our same story," she muttered urgently, as though she was speaking just to Eden. "Many others, within the span of only a few days." Despite the devastating tale, that part made the most impact. In most cases, this meant some kind of animal, a raging, unlikely animal, possibly magical, possibly a few. In other cases, this meant some kind of creature, a subtle distinction that depended on who you asked. Things like banshees or kelpies, ogres or trolls. Things like the handsome man standing at the Fae's side. But these were not most days, so these were not most cases. The Fae could rule out nothing. "How many more?" "Over 20, and those were only the ones with whom we spoke. There could be dozens of others." She wrung her fingers together, so hard as to break the skin. "Will you help us?" The Fae opened his mouth with the natural reply, but the words fell silent on his lips. His eyes flickered back up the stairs, before coming to rest upon Kiera. "I am sorry for your loss and for your panic," he murmured, fingers curving around the woman's hand. "I have no children. I cannot begin to imagine your pain. And I will help you," he added deliberately. "You have my word. But I cannot—" He caught himself, eyes flashing again up the stairs. "A friend of mine is unwell. I cannot—" "This is a boy of 15, the father shouted. "Forget your bloody friend." Eden looked at him with unending patience, a profound sympathy tightening his eyes.
My friend is not many years older than that, and there is a chance that something—"
He trailed off, letting out a quiet breath.
"I swear, if you have not found him by tomorrow, I will— Are you joking, Eden?"
Everyone turned at the same time as another man appeared at the base of the stairs. He had been standing there a while, listening in silence. No one had noticed him until now. Jesse. He stepped forward, staring at the Fae.
"Their son goes missing, the same day I see my dead brother."
Their eyes locked for a brief moment.
"We leave at dawn."
Chapter 14.
The friends did indeed find many others as they travelled further into the mountains, all of them touched with the same tragedy, all of them relieved beyond measure to see a Fae already on the trail. They would throw that tragedy on his shoulders, then depart with a feeling of profound relief, as if their own emotional contribution had come to an end. Over and over, all of them did it. They would have solace, he would have none.
"We should not be doing this,"
Evander said softly, as they stepped through the trees.
"We are looking for a dragon, not this. This is mortal kind of trouble."
There was no longer a path, but they were taking the simplest route, easing gently upwards, just as the missing shifters might have done. In the beginning they had been looking for tracks, something made by wolves, not men. But their perspective had changed the longer they searched. Eden threw him a quick look, walking by his side.
"I cannot imagine they are not connected," he murmured in reply. "And we are here, and they are in trouble."
He said it so simply, catching the vampire's eye.
"This is what my people do."
Evander stared a moment, then took his hand.
"Then we shall do it together."
Kiera glanced over her shoulder, back towards the little town. It was harder to see now, lost in the wide sweep of the valley. That tangle of rivers seemed almost to swallow it, glinting like a spiderweb in the sun. She wondered for the 100th time if they should tell someone, if they should not be keeping word of the dragon to themselves. But the same reasons they'd had before held true that day. People would not mobilize. They would scatter. Some would be picked off immediately, others would fall prey to lesser evils that would not have reached them before. Those who remained in the villages would live in a state of perpetual fear, clutching their children, staring up at the sky. "Don't worry, I've already told a Fae." "What's the matter, Evander?" Jesse called over his shoulder, hacking away at the dense ferns in his path. "Afraid we'll meet some of your kinsmen?" The shifter had been a bit sharper than usual, and the others were granting him a lot of leeway. The vampire had never heard that particular word. They were explaining as best they could. "Killing a bunch of vampires," he continued under his breath, slicing through the swaying branches with his blade. "That would be a real shame." Evander's face stilled in anger, but Eden was quick to squeeze his hand. "Let's take a break." They'd been hiking for the better part of the morning, having left the village at sunrise, just as Jesse said. The day was hot, and they'd been moving with a great deal of caution, heading not westward, but into the same forest they'd been before, where they'd seen the infected cougar. It wasn't the greatest of leads, but under the circumstances, it was the best one they had. Maybe the Fae is right. Maybe it's all connected.
"We should probably sweep the perimeter as well," Eden continued, his bright eyes roving through the trees. "If we are looking for trouble, then it's best we find it first."
Jesse nodded briskly, pushing back to his feet. "I'll do it." The Fae caught his arm.
"Perhaps one of us,"
he suggested lightly, cocking his head towards Evander. He flashed an apologetic smile, rigid beneath the surface.
"Immortal ears."
It was an excuse, and a rather transparent one. Everyone knew a shifter could hear nearly as well as a Fae. Eden was simply worried. He didn't want his friend to run off again, slipping into a trance and following the ghost of murdered siblings into the trees. Kiera stared between them, remembering what he said at the tavern. A friend of mine is unwell, and there is a chance that something... She would give anything to know what he hadn't said. She expected Jesse to be angry, but he wasn't. He merely settled down to build a fire. "You two can take turns. You should be good at that." The vampire was livid, but the Fae merely chuckled under his breath. He stepped again between them, pressing a kiss to Evander's head. "How about I start?" He was gone a second later, spiriting away into the trees. The others settled down in the leaves as a crackling fire sprang to life between them. It was a good thing Evander had decided not to sell the flint. They had use for it after all. "I'll grab us a bucket of water," Kiera murmured, pushing to her feet. "We passed a stream not so long ago. I can still hear—"
"Now that Evander is gone," Evander interrupted sharply, "is there anything else you'd like to say about vampires or the idea of taking turns?"
"On second thought, I think I'll stay."
Jesse stared back in silence, not a shred of emotion on his face.
"He was upset, Evander." Kiera settled back down in between them, just as the Fae had done before. "He meant you no offense." That being said, it didn't look as though Jesse particularly cared. Quite the opposite. And the vampire was not taking the concept of leeway as well as the others had thought. After a few seconds, the shifter cocked his head with a dry smile. "You do not like my jokes?"
"I do not like your jokes."
A frosty silence fell between them, one Kiera felt quite certain Eden would have been able to break if he hadn't chosen that precise moment to vanish into the ether and leave her sitting between two such volatile men. Instead of appealing again to the vampire, she squeezed the shifter's knee. His shoulders fell with a sigh. He was angry, not suicidal. "Then I will keep them to myself," he conceded stiffly. "Kiera's right. I didn't mean you any offense. For whatever reason, Eden likes you."
"He likes me a great deal more than you,"
the vampire interrupted with a smirk.
"He likes taking your pants off,"
Jesse answered sharply.
"There's a difference. Chalk it up to an overdeveloped sense of masochism."
A look of uncertainty flashed across Evander's face, and Kiera realized it was possible to wound him after all, at least about this particular thing. She had thought earlier that at the core of the vampire was pure confidence, but there was nothing confident about him now. He looked as new as a sunburst, as fragile as butterfly wings, just as easy to frighten away. She was not the only one to see it happen.
"I'm sorry," Jesse murmured, bowing his head. "I did not mean it."
Evander nodded curtly, and they stared in silence at the fire. "Yes, I think you did." It was only a few minutes later when Eden returned, holding a trio of freshly picked apples in his hand. He tossed them quickly around the fire, settling down himself.
"I found nothing but these, though the woods are unusually quiet. Perhaps we might want to consider—"
He cut short at the look on Evander's face.
"What's the matter? What happened?"
Nothing. The vampire and the shifter spoke at the same time. When Eden turned incredulously to Kiera, she rolled her eyes. "I guess nothing's wrong." The friends ate quickly, then put out the fire and got back on the trail. There had been no further confrontations, but Jesse made himself deliberately scarce, keeping far to the front. For almost a mile, Eden stared at the back of his head. Then he turned again to the vampire.
"What's wrong?" he asked quietly. "Will you please tell me?"
If he'd been talking to anyone else, there was a good chance he wouldn't have gotten an answer. But the vampire didn't know the games, and he wouldn't have played them. He spoke softly, keeping his eyes on the ground.
"Do you have an overdeveloped sense of masochism?"
The Fae let out a burst of laughter, caught by surprise.
"I suppose I do," he answered. "Is there a better way to live?"
In the silence that followed, the smile faded from his face.
"Why are you asking?"
More silence, longer this time.
Is that why you're with me? Evander asked quietly. Is it the reason we're together?
Eden stopped moving, right in the center of the trail. He waited there until the vampire stopped as well, then crossed the distance between them and took him by the hands.
No, that is not why I'm with you.
He spoke quietly, each gentle word in stark contrast to the intensity of his gaze.
I am with you for the exact opposite reason.
Evander avoided his eyes, answering with a hint of reluctance.
And what is that?
Eden reached out with a smile, lifting the vampire's chin.
There is a light inside you, Evander. It might not be well tended, but it's there.
His eyes twinkled in the rising sun.
It is that light that draws me closer.
The friends hiked until dusk. The slope got steadily higher, and the woods were just as empty as the Fae had said. Even the birds were silent. It was a little unnerving, like the cresting of a wave about to break.
I was hoping to find something before nightfall,
Eden murmured after a long stretch of silence, lifting his eyes towards the sky.
But the sun is already sinking. It will be dark before long.
Kiera shivered in spite of herself.
He was hoping to find something.
It might not have been said directly, but he no longer believed they would find any of the shifters alive. She was starting to agree.
I could always start calling for them, Evander said casually, hiking along beside them. If the culprit truly is one of us barbaric vampires, they might just follow the sound of my voice.
Eden cast him a tired look, but said nothing. The Fae's earlier words had soothed away the worry, brightening the vampire in a way he didn't expect. But that had been hours ago, and he'd more than enough time to sink back into a miserable introspective. The longer they were silent, the worse it seemed to become.
Of course, there's a chance they won't understand, he continued, beheading dandelions with a flick of his hand. Most of us don't speak the common tongue, or any other language. We communicate solely through blood rituals and strategic glares.
The Fae let out a slow breath, searching for patience.
Oh yes, he quipped. How about a demonstration? Let's see if you can walk in stoic silence for the rest of the way.
On second thought, the Fae weren't known for their patience. Evander shot him such a look, and the others were convinced there was something to the glaring after all. Not one to be dissuaded, he stepped up his game.
If that's what you wish, he replied stiffly. If it helps, I can always return to the tavern and wait for you there. Gods forbid you're seen in the company of such a creature.
Enough! Eden whirled around in exasperation, stopping the group in its tracks. Why do you put that on me? When you know I do not think it. When you know the only person voicing that opinion is yourself. A ceaseless worry that troubles only one man is not a shared problem, Evander. Whatever weight there is to bear, you bear it yourself. Such talk is beneath us, and I will not hear it. He stormed ahead without a backward glance, unaware of the others staring behind him. A ceaseless worry that troubles only one man is not a shared problem, Jessie repeated with a crooked grin. Why do you always speak as though you've swallowed a book of Proverbs? The Fae threw him a cold look, never slowing his pace. Where do you think Proverbs come from? There is a reason my people were granted an eternity and tasked with defending this world. Timeless words of wisdom come with the...
There was a rush of leaves, followed by a panicked shout. Then the Fae was dangling in the air.
Eden!
Evander lunged forward, actually catching the tip of the Fae's fingers, but he released him just as fast, taking a moment to assess the situation before stepping back with a little smile.
Well, look at you.
It was a net, Kiera realized, lowering her hands slowly from her mouth. A massive, twisting net that had been hidden in the leaves. It was the kind of thing that the more skilled hunters had used around her village when they could afford to buy the rope. The kind of thing that Eden would have seen in a heartbeat if he hadn't been so busy extolling the enduring wisdom of the Fae. She gave him a little push, watching as he swung back and forth.
"Get me down from here!"
But the Fae's friends were no longer listening. In fact, it was safe to say they were no longer his friends. He was their prisoner now, hanging upside down in an inexorable tangle, only little pieces of him still visible, with the tips of his long hair dusting the leaves. Jessie cast a look towards the heavens, lips curling in a little grin. "Did you do that just for me?" Eden cried out in frustration, cursing in his native tongue.
"Evan, come here!"
he demanded, reaching helplessly for the vampire's hands. For a second, it looked like he might have gotten close enough. Then the breeze swung him the other way.
"This is intolerable!"
He cursed again, fighting against the rope. "If I had not been so distracted." "It is a poor craftsman who blames his tools," Kiera said sagely. Eden rotated slowly towards her, white with rage.
"Get me down!"
Jessie patted him on the leg. "In time," he promised. "They say patience is bitter, but its fruits are sweet." There was another vengeful cry.
"Do not proverb at me!"
But there was no point. The Fae's weapons had fallen to the ground, and a force larger than himself was keeping him still. The others proceeded to proverb at him to their heart's delight. The only one who didn't partake was the vampire. Evander was watching in silence, arms folded across his chest and a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. When the Fae swung slowly towards him, he tilted his head with a sweet smile. "Would you like something to drink?" The pair of them locked eyes. "Get me down now." The vampire didn't move. "I'm getting ideas for later."
"Malicos!"
The Fae struggled against the mess of knots, leveling every bit of that immortal strength, only to find himself in exactly the same position as when he'd started. He gave up only a moment later, more twisted than when he'd started and panting for breath.
"I guarantee you'll be enjoying them by yourself if you do not free me from these ropes!"
Kiera folded her arms, surveying him appraisingly. "I remember a time when you wanted to string me up like that," she remarked. "How did you phrase it? Ah yes, you wanted to use me as bait to catch the large predators." Evander smiled fondly. "We have more and more in common."
"Enough!"
It was perhaps an act of mercy, or perhaps fear of the Fae's inevitable retribution, but Jessie took out his knife and slashed the ropes in a few strategic places. There was a shuddering from the branches above, then the entire thing collapsed, spilling the Fae to the ground with it. He landed on his knees, taking a second to recover himself, before shaking off the lingering strands and pushing to his feet. His cheeks were flushed, while the rest of him was literally trembling with fury. His eyes lifted slowly to his friends, resting a moment upon each one.
"I'm going to make you a promise. By sundown tomorrow..."
There was a rush of air, followed by a streak of shadow. Then the Fae vanished again. "Eden!" This time the rest of them flew into action. Kiera raced after the others, not seeing what they were seeing, only hearing the signs of a violent struggle, yips and snarls, sharp impacts, and a distant cry of pain. By the time she pushed through the ferns and into the open air, she could not believe what she was seeing. Eden was pinned to the ground by a vampire, who was not Evander.
"Karos!"
he cried, pushing wildly against it. His weapons were still lying on the forest floor, and he was holding it back with nothing but the strength of his bare hands.
"Someone!"
Evander was there a second later, flying into the clearing at such speed that his feet scarcely touched the ground. The only reason he hadn't gotten there sooner was because the vampire had taken the precaution of striking him first. His head was still spinning, but his eyes were clear. "Seven hells!" He tackled the vampire with such force, the others felt the impact in their shoes, hurling it away from Eden and to the other side of the clearing. It wasn't until the creature landed that Kiera got a look at it for the first time. Her, she realized in shock. The vampire was a woman. She looked very much like Evander, while also looking entirely different. The two of them were alike in beauty and colouring, but she was slight of stature, with a mane of wild hair that had been tied back with a string. Both feet were bare and bloody, either from her struggle with the Fae or simply from walking through the woods. Her eyes were different as well. There was something deeply unsettling about her eyes. She landed on her feet and whipped right back around, preparing to launch herself once more at the Fae. But the fight was already finished. She would never get the chance. With a single hand, Evander picked her up by the back of the neck and cratered her into the earth, shaking the surrounding trees. Her eyelids fluttered as he placed a knee upon her chest, baring his fangs with an expression that was sure to give his friends nightmares for years to come. In spite of everything, she was still reaching, always reaching for Eden. Those dark eyes of hers were dilated almost completely black, but there was a manic light at the core. Evander had a solution for that as well. There was a blistering roar, followed by a distressing rip as he wrapped his fingers around those offending arms, the ones that had struck against his lover, and gave them a mighty tug. They severed at the shoulders, like a doll tearing apart at the seams. She died quickly after that, screaming until the very end, and then nothing. A deafening silence fell over the clearing, pulsing like a heartbeat in each of their ears. It froze each one like some kind of spell. Jesse was still gripping his blade, but his fingers had gone loose around the handle. Kiera was just a step behind, arms hanging limp by her sides. No matter how long she stood there, no matter how much time had passed, she couldn't seem to reconcile the image, like her eyes and her brain were unable to force it together. She is dead. She is dead. In so many pieces. Eden was still lying on the ground, half cratered into it. His clothes were torn and his face was shock white, but his eyes were clear as well, fixed upon a single thing. Evander? The vampire whipped around with a snarl, curved over the body like an animal defending its kill. That same frenzy still gripped him, but he went instantly quiet when his eyes fell upon the Fae. He took an instinctive step towards him, but stopped himself almost as fast. The fangs deliberately retracted. The coiled fingers were smoothed on his legs. His lips fluttered in silence, almost as though he was counting. Then he drew in a steadying breath.
Are you all right?
No, the Fae was most certainly not all right. But it was clear from a look the vampire was not all right himself. Eden hitched onto his elbows, unable to fully catch his breath.
I'm fine.
Evander was at his side a moment later, fixing his clothes and checking for damage, lifting him higher and cupping a supportive hand behind his head. The two leaned closer, angling their faces like they were going to kiss, but Eden pulled back at the last moment.
There's blood on your mouth.
With those words, the stillness that gripped the clearing shattered. The others drew shakily closer, clinging to each other's hands, as Evander wiped his face with the back of his sleeve.
None of it is mine, he muttered. It was all hers.
The Fae nodded, eyes on the ground.
Was she the one who did this?
Kiera asked breathlessly, taking great pains not to look at the pieces of the vampire scattered across the ground.
Was she the one who placed the net?
The men glanced up at the same time, having not yet strung it together. After all their teasing, after all their searching, could it have been a vampire they were looking for after all?
A vampire does not set traps, Evander murmured with a frown, but they can scavenge from them.
His eyes flashed back through the forest, finding the dented leaves where the creature had sat.
She has been here a while, feeding on whatever animals strayed into the net.
He opened his mouth to say more, then went abruptly still.
Which means...
She was touched with the same madness, Kiera whispered in horror, remembering the crazed look in the vampire's eyes. It's why she couldn't control herself. It's why... Evander rounded immediately upon the Fae. Did she bite you? He asked urgently, or scratch you with her nails, even a little? Eden shook his head, still shaken to the core.
No, I don't think so.
It was not a good enough answer. With a lot less delicacy than he'd used before, the vampire checked for himself, running hands over every inch of him, combing through his hair. Not until his hands came up clean did he manage to take a breath. There is nothing, he exhaled in relief. Not a drop of blood. Eden extracted himself painfully, lifting to his feet. But something set the trap. Something has been here. His eyes drifted further up the mountain.
We have to be getting close.
It wasn't long after nightfall. The friends finally decided to make camp. None of them had wanted to stay in the open, but none of them wanted to be in remote proximity to the net. Whatever or whoever was pulling the strings had a very long reach. They needed to find them, but they would do it in the day.
This is a better place than most,
Eden said wearily, pausing beside an outcropping of rocks and glancing into the shallow cave.
Easily guarded, though. I don't imagine we'll be here long.
Kiera paused behind him, peering into the dark. Could someone...
We'll check for bears.
The answer came back from 3 different directions. Even the vampire had chimed in, though his eyes remained fixed on the forest behind them, searching through the shadowy trees. I will keep watch. This was not a question. The others didn't challenge it. They didn't have the time or energy to collect wood for a fire, or perhaps each of them was too secretly rattled to venture from the cave. However she tried to distract herself, Kiera couldn't stop remembering the scene from the forest, the way the 2 vampires collided together, shaking the ground beneath them, the sound of ripping flesh when Evander tore her to pieces, the look on his face when Eden called his name. In a way, it had been the most frightening moment of all. She'd been half convinced Evander was going to attack him. The vampire had been half convinced himself. Are you all right? He asked for the 100th time. Truly. Since leaving the bloody mess behind them, he couldn't stop asking the question, nor could he seem to remove himself from Eden's side. The slightest breath was enough to draw his attention. The faintest wince brought his eyes. It would have been almost comical if the situation wasn't so serious. As it stood, the Fae was making a concerted effort to keep from wringing his neck.
I'm fine, Evander.
But your shoulder...
My shoulder is fine.
The vampire nodded and swept silently from the cave, running a quick check of the perimeter before settling in the mouth of the cave to guard the others so they could sleep. Jessie waited until he was gone before glancing back at the Fae. How's your shoulder? Eden's eyes flashed up sharply before warming with a smile.
It's probably broken. Hurts like hell.
He stretched it in front of him, settling on the floor of the cave.
How's your face?
The second the danger had passed, Eden had walked calmly up to both the shifter and the vampire and struck them both across the face. Retribution for leaving him in the net. Kiera had not been struck. He'd shoved her into a tree. Oh, you know. Jessie settled down beside him. Really bad. The 2 waited expectantly until Kiera settled beside them. She hadn't said much since the incident with the vampire. Both were feeling rather protective, given the look on her face.
You had never seen one before?
Eden asked softly.
Aside from Evander?
Her eyes tightened around the edges. Then she shook her head. There was much to say about it. Probably too much. But she didn't have the stomach for it now. She was still trying to reconcile that she lived in a world where people could be torn to pieces. And Evander, he didn't even blink an eye. I'm sorry for asking you to do this, Jessie said unexpectedly, remembering his sharp words at the tavern for the Fae. I didn't think it would... He trailed off, bowing his head. "I'm sorry." Eden regarded him with a touch of surprise.
"You asked for nothing. It was the families of the victims who made the request."
His eyes danced with the hint of a smile.
"And I don't believe for a second that you're sorry." The shifter chuckled, rubbing absent-mindedly at his face. "Not so much, but I am grateful you would help the others search," he added suddenly. "If someone like you had been closer after Emery, I might have sought you out myself." If the wolf's day had been difficult before, it became promptly unbearable at the mention of his brother. Without another word, he flashed the others a tight smile and lay down in the corner to go to sleep. Eden joined him not long after, feeling that shoulder a lot more than he was letting on. By the time Evander returned a few minutes later, Kiera was the only one left awake. "Did you find anything?" she asked, the moment he stepped inside. He glanced up in surprise, then shook his head.
"Not a single track."
She nodded, feeling strangely unsurprised. Whatever they were dealing with wasn't the kind of thing to leave tracks. It was the kind of thing that crazed vampires and lay traps, the kind that raised haunting memories from years past. It would not leave footprints.
"So, I guess we'll find it in the morning."
She said it with as much cheer as she could muster, but there was a chance that didn't quite work. Evander glanced over immediately, making a quick study of her face. He hesitated a moment, inwardly debating. Then, to her intense surprise, he slipped his arms around her in a fleeting embrace.
"We'll find it in the morning."
The friends went to sleep shortly after. That was their first mistake. Their second was thinking they would be allowed to wake. They didn't notice when the breeze picked up, filling the cave with a strange and dizzying scent. They didn't notice when their attention started to waver, when things began to muddle and the conversation no longer made sense. They didn't notice when they dropped onto the stone, one after another. And they didn't notice the old man from the tavern standing outside.
"Wake up, darling. It's time to go."
The shifter rose from the heart of a deep slumber, a blank expression smoothing the edges of his face. His eyes glassed over and his limbs went docile, lifting him like a puppet on a string. In a daze, he stepped over the sleeping vampire and out of the cavern, into a pair of waiting arms. His friends never saw the look of surprise, or heard the muted struggle, the quickening of breathing, and the quiet tearing of clothes. By the time they opened their eyes the next morning, the world and everything in it was exactly as it should be. There was just one notable exception. Jessie was gone. This has been Foresight, written by W.J.May, narrated by Zach Smith.